Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the first part of What If Deku Had a Beast Quirk. All credit for this story goes to Southern Cookie 73, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku was on his way back to campus after spending the Saturday night at home with his mum to celebrate her birthday together over dinner. He had caught the train already from his hometown to the station closest to UA, but it was still a 25-minute walk to the campus gates. It was a clear sunny afternoon, and the only plans he had left for the day was doing some finishing touches on the weekend's English homework and doing some exercise before bed. Being a town that houses one of the country's best hero corps schools, the town was usually peaceful and quiet with very little crime, but that didn't mean it didn't exist. Walking down the street, Izuku's school-related thoughts were interrupted by a loud yelp from down an alleyway, and he instinctively stopped mid-stride to listen more closely. He heard a yell followed by another high-pitched yelp, and he jumped into action. He ducked into the alleyway, getting low into a crouch and skirting the walls when he heard several voices ahead. Despite his passion to jump in and rescue anyone in trouble, he knew better and to be cautious and determined to risk first. As he neared the end of the shadowed space, he peeked out from around an overflowing bin to see what the noise was, taking extra mind to not bump his backpack into anything and give himself away. The alleyway opened into a small concrete courtyard that the rear of the shop in front connected to, and 3 men were standing around a white object on the ground. They were chuckling and cursing at each other with smirks as one of them booted the white object, and it whipped its head back in a warning bite that missed its mark and yelped again. It was a large white dog they were kicking, and Izuku knew that being a hero wasn't limited to just saving humans. He burst out from behind the bin to call a warning to the men. He had his license, and was in his right to take them all down for animal abuse. "Do that again and I'll take all of you down!" he barked at them, channeling his inner cack in anger, minus the words kill, die, or murder. The 3 men turned their heads to face him, uncertain at first, and then scoffed at him. They were all larger and taller than Izuku, and without his hero outfit or school uniform, they didn't know who they were messing with at a glance. "Come on, kids, scram!" called the tallest of the 3. "Yeah, it's none of your business. This mutt was stealing from our bins. Just teaching it a lesson," spoke up the largest of the 3 with a head roll. "Doesn't mean you should kick it," spat back Izuku with a determined glare of his own, and he raised his fists, small green sparks starting to fly. "Gah, forget it," spoke up the last man with a shrug and took a long inhale of his cigarette before dropping it on the ground and crushing it under his shoe. The larger man glanced at Izuku again, scoffed, and the 3 of them headed back into their store from the rear door, the metal door clanging shut loudly. With the courtyard clear, Izuku rushed forward to kneel beside the large dog. Spots of blood were showing through its dirted white fur, and it was panting heavily, the whites of its eyes showing as it gazed up at Izuku. Izuku had never grown up with dogs or been close friends with anyone who had one, and overall his interactions with dogs throughout his life had been brief moments in parks, and he had certainly never seen a dog this big before in person. So Izuku had no understanding of dog behavior. He wasn't aware of the signs or the phrase, "let sleeping dogs lie." When he reached out to touch it, to reassure it with a pat that it was alright and that he would take it somewhere safe like a vet, the hurt and frightened dog lashed out with more speed than Izuku would have thought possible and bit him on his left forearm. The dog released him, and the sudden movement and burst of pain was enough for Izuku to fall back and get to his feet several feet away, clutching at his bleeding arm. The dog slowly staggered to its feet, head hanging and panting, blood dripping from its open mouth, but Izuku didn't know if it was his or the dog's. "I'm sorry," spoke Izuku in a gentle voice, trying not to startle the dog further. He lowered himself into a squat so he would look smaller to the scared dog. "I didn't mean to startle you. I only want to help," he added, and the dog's head turned to face him with blue eyes before it turned away and staggered down the alleyway. As much as Izuku wanted to run after it to help, he knew now for certain now that the dog didn't want his help, and he hadn't seen a collar on it either with a way to contact its owner. Izuku moved to stand back up, still clutching his arm, but it suddenly throbbed so harshly that he felt light-headed and fell back several steps to lean against a brick wall. His arm was throbbing and burning, and the pain started to radiate up his arm. He closed his eyes tightly and gritted his teeth as the pain only intensified till it reached every corner of his body, and he dropped to his knees on the concrete trying to stifle a cry. His body seared with pain and his heart picked up pace till he was panting down at the ground, tears streaming from his eyes. A jolt like electricity shot up his spine and he twitched. He toppled to his side, his body convulsing violently from the waves of pain shooting through him. He couldn't even scream if he wanted to. He closed his eyes tightly, his body rippling with the pain. He wished it away and then it was suddenly gone. He opened his eyes and staggered to his feet low to the ground and shook his head. His head felt heavy and clouded like he had just woken up from a bad nap. He couldn't think straight and tried to recall where he was and what happened. That's right. He got bitten by the dog. He tried to help but his arm barely hurt now. He tried to lift it to look but something wasn't right. He could feel himself lifting it but couldn't see it. A door clanged shut, the metal on the door rattling in a painful way, and Izuku turned his head to face the door. One of the men he had encountered just before had stepped out from the shop's rear door to have a smoke when he froze and glared down at Izuku. I don't remember him being that tall, he thought to himself as he gazed up at the man. Fuck, another one. What are we, a picnic for you mongrels? He hissed down at Izuku and stepped forward, stomping a foot down hard in Izuku's direction, and the sudden sound made him flinch back involuntarily. Go on, get out of here! Called the man and waved his hands frantically. More men came through the back door and scowled at him. Fuckers, hissed the large man, and he marched over to Izuku's side. He turned his head to look to him with confusion before the man landed a kick to Izuku's side and he was pushed over. The pain seared through his ribs, and he staggered back to his feet, annoyed that he had been too slow to move away. The man came closer, and he walked past a bundle of clothing and a backpack as he did to try to kick at him again. That's my bag, thought Izuku sharply as he recognized it. He glanced down at the concrete ground, which was much closer to his face than he had recalled, and saw two dark green shaggy paws under him. Panic rose in his throat, and he lifted his head back up to the men, hoping that they would recognize him as the boy from before, that they would help, but the larger man swung a leg out again, and this time Izuku leapt away, crashing into the overflowing bin, before his foot could connect. The bin toppled over him, the men cried out with annoyance and rushed forward and, with panic urging him on, Izuku turned and ran down the alleyway. His mind was racing too fast to stop and wonder as to how his new four-legged body could move so smoothly under him, but he was running faster than he ever had before without a quirk, and there was only one place he could think of to go. He shot through the gates of UA, a few other students returning shrieking as he sped past. He didn't know where else to go, and ran through the campus until he burst through the front doors of the first floor of the 1A dorms. Mina Ishido let out a scream when Izuku burst in, and the other students who were already present on the first floor rushed over to her to see what was wrong. A few of the students gasped when they took in the sight of Izuku and he stepped closer, hoping that they would recognize him. They stepped back with alarmed noises. They were scared of him, and he looked pleadingly from one face to the next. He opened his mouth to try to speak, but only a bark escaped him. He barked more and more, trying desperately to get words out, but the students only seemed to step further away. Finally Kirishima stepped forward and used his hardening quirk on his arms, as he reached forward to grab Izuku by the scruff and dragged him deeper into the space. Why the hell is there a big-ass dog here? Shrieked Kaminari from behind the line of students. Is he yours, Koda? Asked Ida, and the quiet boy shook his head. It's scary, whispered Ishido as she clung to the closest girl, Uraraka. Izuku didn't understand why Kirishima was pulling at him. This is where he wanted to be, he didn't have to force him in, but then he noticed where he was taking him, he started to dig in his heels. Come on, you'll be safe in here, spoke up Kirishima through gritted teeth as he fought against Izuku. He was dragging him towards the grassy courtyard that sat in the middle on the first floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass windows and opened up directly to the sky above. Kirishima was winning the battle and Zyro stepped forward to open the sliding door for him, and he hauled Izuku over the threshold and slid the door closed quickly, locking it. Izuku turned back, standing on his hind legs to scrabble at the door. There was no latch on the inside for him to unlock the door, and his classmates just looked at him fearfully the more frantically he tried to claw at the door. He tried calling out to them, only barking escaping his throat, and he gritted his teeth as he lowered his head with frustration. No tears came out. "Oh, it looks pissed." He heard Minato from inside and Izuku relaxed his jaw, not realizing that to them it would look like a snarl. But surrounded by glass, Izuku could finally see himself. He was a large dog, covered head to tail with thick dark green fur, the same as his hair color. His fur was thick and shaggy, his tail straight but fluffy and his ears pointed with a long muzzle. Back in the alley he had thought that the white dog he had rescued looked like a wolf from pictures he had seen, and now he looked the exact same aside from the color. There was a patch of fur missing from his upper right front leg where his burn had been, but the skin underneath was darker in color, and the scar and lack of fur wasn't too visible. As he stared at his reflection, deep green eyes stared back. "It looks like a wolf," called Ishido from the other side of the glass, but she kept her distance still. "There's no wolves in Japan," scoffed Zyro, who was closer to the glass than some of the others. "Something like an Alaskan Malamute then?" offered Uraraka. "No way," spoke up Minato surprisingly as he pressed his face to the glass and Izuku looked to him. "His tail doesn't curl up and he's not that fluffy. He's more scruffy and wild-looking." "He?" asked Ishido. "Yeah," he replied. "It's hard to see through all the fur, but if you look close dash." Izuku backed away from the staring great boy and laid his body lower to the ground, his ears laying flat from his embarrassment. "What the hell is all the noise?" barked Bakugo as he exited the elevator on the far end of the first floor and shuffled over in slippers and his hands shoved in his pockets with an annoyed scowl to top it off. "Kirishima caught a dog," replied Kaminari almost excitedly. "Huh!" Bakugo narrowed his eyes and cocked his head to the side. "I didn't catch it, him," replied Kirishima with a frown. "He just burst in." When Bakugo only stared at the red-haired boy, he pointed at the courtyard glass and Bakugo followed. Izuku felt hope flare up as his childhood friend glared at him through narrowed eyes and he got to his feet again and came up to the glass, rearing back up on his hind legs and pawing at the glass between him and Bakugo. He let out a few barks that he hoped sounded friendly. "See there!" called out Minato as he pointed through the glass and Izuku was suddenly overcome with embarrassment again and dropped to his belly right there. He couldn't look any of them in the eye. "Well, what the hell are you going to do with it?" asked Bakugo, still sounding grumpy. "Oh, I don't know," replied Kirishima with a rub at the back of his neck. He hadn't thought that far. "We should inform the teachers at once," answered Ida with a hand raised to the ceiling, and the girls agreed. "Yeah, then they can bring in a dog catcher," smiled Kaminari, and panic bloomed inside Izuku again. He stood back up on all fours and walked in several tight circles as he felt a wave of anxiety, not knowing how to communicate with them. "Surely he could just stay there for the night," offered up Yaoyorozu thoughtfully. "His owner may be looking for him." "He doesn't have a collar," said Kirishima. "But if the dog catchers come tonight it will cost the school more being a weekend," spoke up Ida. "That wouldn't be good for the school." "Like the school cares," scoffed Bakugo at the group and turned to leave back the way he came, and Izuku was left feeling miserable while the other students decided his fate. Eventually the girls, all except Ishido who did not like large dogs at all, had talked the boys into keeping him around for the night and pressured Ida into not telling the teachers till tomorrow, which came as a huge relief to Izuku, but without a way to communicate it didn't solve much. He barked at Koda a few times through the glass hoping that he could understand him, but the boy just looked confused. Izuku was aware that Koda's quirk allowed him to command and hear animals when he chose to, but was limited at animal-shaped creatures, and not being a raw dog meant that Koda could not understand him. But the quiet boy knew that too and kept glancing Izuku's way but was too timid to approach. Once the panic and adrenaline had worn off, Izuku could feel the sting of the bite mark through his fur, and the ache on his side from the kick earlier. His classmates put dinner offcuts and scraps into a bowl for him as well as another for water, and Kirishima, using his hardening quirk again, dropped them just by the door for him. Izuku would have charged forward if Shoji wasn't standing behind him, ready to catch him if he did, and he didn't want to give his classmates any more reason to be scared of him. The food provided included cooked rice and steamed veggies as well as meat, although the offcuts of meat were raw, and he wasn't desperate enough to eat that, and instead turned his attention to the rice and vegetables. He felt messy and uncoordinated drinking the water and spilt it over his front paws. Luckily, even the night air was warm enough that they dried off quickly. The girls and a handful of the boys too felt more comfortable to coo at him through the glass before everyone disappeared upstairs to bed. He had heard at least one student mention his name in passing, asking if he had returned. No one had an answer, and they just assumed that he had snuck past them to his room earlier in the day. With the lights off, Izuku could do nothing more than curl up on the soft grass by the sliding door and sleep. His ears pricked up during the night to a noise and lifted his head to see a figure shuffling down the side of the courtyard and flick on a light in the kitchen to get themselves a drink, and Izuku was thrilled to see it was Bakugo. Although he was the type to go to bed early, he was a light sleeper, and judging from his scowl, he wasn't pleased to have been woken by something. In the dark, Izuku pawed at the glass between them, and Bakugo flinched at the noise, slowly turning to glare at the dog. He must have forgotten he was there. As he picked up the outline of the dog in the spilling kitchen light, Bakugo relaxed and finished his drink of water before putting the glass down and approaching. Izuku whined and gave a few small friendly yips, trying to encourage his childhood friend in. Bakugo walked around the courtyard to the sliding door, and Izuku stayed back, his tail wagging slightly with the hope that if anyone would notice him it would be Bakugo. The blonde opened the sliding door to enter, sliding it closed behind him, and crouched in front of the large dog and held out a hand for it to sniff. But Izuku didn't need to sniff him to know who he was, and he stepped forward to lower his head against Bakugo's hand, whining as he did. Bakugo just ruffled the shorter fur on top of his head, and Izuku was a little surprised by how good it felt to be patted. "See, you're not so scary," smiled Bakugo, revealing a softer side that probably no human had seen before. "What a bunch of babies!" He scoffed at the thought of his classmates. "You need a bath, though," he commented, and Izuku was sure he smelt like garbage. Izuku whined more under his hand. "Your owner will find you soon," spoke Bakugo as he got back to his feet and turned to leave. "You're too good-looking of a dog to not have a home." Izuku whined after him even more, but Bakugo wasn't understanding, and Izuku took his chance. The moment the door slid open, Izuku charged forward, feeling bad for knocking down his classmate who let out a string of curses. But he didn't stop, his claws scrabbling on the smooth floor to get a grip, and then he charged off towards the stairs. Bakugo was already on his heels, grumbling at him as he chased after the large dog in the middle of the night. Izuku bounded up the stairs to the second floor and skidded to a halt at the third door down the left side. Bakugo had already reached the top of the stairs and came for him. Izuku got onto his hind paws and clawed desperately at the lever door handle until it was pushed down, and he pushed through the door a moment before Bakugo's hand snatched at the air where he had just been. In the room, Izuku dove onto his bed and wriggled under the all-night covers. Bakugo swung the door open and flicked on the light, not caring if he disturbed the nerd sleeping inside. He spotted the green tail sticking out from under the bed covers instantly, but paused. He hadn't heard the nerd scream out in shock to him, and a dog barging into his room. Izuku whined from under the covers, and Bakugo crept closer until he was near enough to pull the cover from the dog, who curled up tighter and glanced up at Bakugo standing over him. Bakugo's face dropped from one of rage to one of mild shock. "Deku?" He spoke up in a whisper, and the dog's tail wiggled a little bit with another whine. "This better be worth it," scowled Izawa from the front door steps of the teacher's dorm. Bakugo had run there with Izuku in tow like the best trained dog ever and knocked on the door until someone answered. Midnight had been the one to answer, and upon seeing students from Class 1A had gone to fetch Izawa, who now glared down at them. "Deku is a dog," replied Bakugo, gesturing to the dark large dog beside him. Izawa, a cat person, glanced down at the dog through his sleep-deprived eyes and then back up at one of his problem children from his class. "It's a dog," he announced. "It's Deku," insisted Bakugo with a snarl. He did not like to repeat himself. "And why do you think that?" sighed Izawa. Bakugo growled with frustration before he started. "Deku wasn't in his room tonight," he started. "Look at him." He gestured wildly at Izuku again. "He's the same color fur and eyes, and he's shaggy, and he has the burn on his arm in the same place." He even thought he sounded like a crazy person to himself as he listed the reasons. "Midoriya wasn't in his room?" For once Izawa actually seemed to be listening, and Bakugo quickly explained how his classmates had locked up Izuku when he burst in looking like a dog, and how he had gotten loose to lead Bakugo back to Izuku's room. "He responded to Deku," he finished. "Just because a dog responds to a name, doesn't mean it's that person," sighed Izawa as he stepped down to look closer at Izuku. "It's Deku," he growled through clenched jaws. "Look," he turned to face Izuku. "Well, do something a normal dog wouldn't do," he ordered, and Izuku suddenly felt panic and walked in a tight circle again when he felt anxious. Izawa looked doubtful, and Bakugo grumbled at Izuku for his stupidity. Finally Izuku thought of something at least and stood up on his hind legs, teetering back and forth a few steps to keep his balance, and barked at Izawa before turning in a circle slowly, and then dropping back down to all fours. A backflip had come to mind, but Izuku didn't think he could pull that off in this body without practice. There was only so much he could do in this body, and he glanced up at Bakugo, hoping it was enough. "All right. I'm listening," replied Izawa with narrowed eyes and his tone more serious. "I just told you everything already," hissed Bakugo, but Izawa held a finger up for him to wait and stepped back inside, leaving the two boys waiting in the dark. Bakugo crossed his arms with a huff, and Izuku stood beside him looking to him and the door with impatience. "You know, you really need a damn bath," grumbled Bakugo without looking back, and Izuku let out a huff and small whine. He knew that already, and would have bathed if he could. His nose was even more sensitive right now, and he could smell the garbage stink far more than Bakugo could. Izawa returned a few minutes later with another teacher in tow. This one being Hound Dog, in a large, fluffy robe and minus the muzzle. Izawa must have already explained the situation, and Hound Dog came to squat right beside Izuku, who felt his new animal instincts urging him to back away from the large-toothed dogman. His fur along his spine bristled involuntarily, and Bakugo gave him an odd glance. Hound Dog leaned in close and took in several long sniffs before standing back up. "Yep, that's Midoriya all right," he growled, and Izawa thanked him with a nod. "Let us teachers handle this," Izawa spoke to the boys. "We will find out what happened and how to fix it. For now, though, you two boys head back to the dorms, and we will touch base tomorrow. There's a possibility that it may wear off in its own time. Until then, Bakugo, you're in charge." "What?" barked Bakugo. "You brought him here. You can care for him," Izawa enforced with a stern look. "The school can cover the cost of any dog-related items you need. For now, good night," he finished, and turned to head back inside with Hound Dog. Bakugo turned on his heel to glare down at Izuku, and he whined and lowered his ears in submission. Bakugo huffed with annoyance, and then turned to head back to the dorm, Izuku trotting along beside him. Back at their dorm, Izuku lingered outside, not following Bakugo in, and the boy turned back to glare at him, and Izuku turned his head from him to the tree line and back. This time Bakugo got the message and rolled his eyes. "Be quick then," he ordered, and Izuku took off towards the trees at a run. Being in the small courtyard where everyone could see him, he had refused to relieve himself out of embarrassment. Once Bakugo had figured out the truth, he had been in such a rush that he hadn't had the chance to try to go, and after some thought he figured using an actual toilet would be impossible for him. He could picture his big paws slipping on the smooth surface. He hid himself among the trees and wiped his paws across clean grass when he was done, and returned to the frowning blonde, and he pushed the door open to let Izuku inside. During the day, when the doors were kept unlocked, he could push through them easily, but once they were locked at night, not so much. Bakugo told him to go to his own room to sleep and to wait for him in the morning, deciding that if Izuku was still a large dog come morning, walking around the place himself was only going to make his classmates scream again. Izuku listened and let himself into his room and nosed the door softly closed behind him. He wanted to sleep on his own bed, but he smelled so bad that he didn't want to make it stink as well, or at least any worse than when he was in it briefly before, so he settled for curling up on the ground beside it and fell asleep. He woke to some of his classmates' voices drifting up from downstairs, calling in a panic that the dog was gone, and Izuku perked up more when he heard footsteps coming towards his door and Bakugo let himself in. Stared down at him when he saw that he was still a dog and then turned back around. "Deku, come!" he called, and Izuku got to his paws and trotted to catch up to him, walking beside Bakugo as he trudged down the stairs with an evil amused smirk on his face, and Izuku let out a snort at him. "Just because I look like a dog doesn't mean you have to treat me like one," he scolded Kaken internally. As Bakugo reached the first floor with Izuku beside him, the other students that were already down looked shocked and surprised, and Ishido ducked behind Ida with a squeal. "Bakugo," called Ida sternly, "you should not be letting strange animals sleep in your room." He waved an arm stiffly at him. "He's not a dog," scoffed back Bakugo with an eye roll. "It's stupid, Deku." Izuku let out a low rumble to let Bakugo know he wasn't pleased with being called stupid. They all opened their mouths to ask questions when Aizawa walked in, and after gathering the rest of the students had a brief discussion, confirmed Bakugo's words, and the students all seemed to relax more. Uraruka even felt bold enough to approach and pet Izuku on the head while he sat beside Bakugo, and he closed his eyes and wagged his tail at the touch. "Watch it, he stinks," called Bakugo as he stepped away to have breakfast, and more of the students gathered around to pet Izuku on the head. He opened his mouth to pant with his tongue out with relief. Ishido was the last one to approach, needing encouragement from Uraruka and Hagakure to finally come forward, and reached out a hand to Izuku, who lowered his head for her, and once she petted him she broke down into tears for overcoming a fear, and the girls giggled and congratulated her. Aizawa turned back to them on his way to the door. "Bakugo, give him a bath before class starts," he called back, ignoring the raging blondes yelling. "He's your responsibility," waved back their teacher and left. "Have fun with that," laughed Kaminari over his shoulder to Bakugo in the kitchen, and yelped as he ducked down to avoid a wooden spoon being thrown his way. There wasn't enough time left in the morning for a proper meal and to bathe a large dog, so Bakugo shoved a slice of untoasted bread in his mouth and marched back over to Izuku, waving the extras away from him, and held another slice of bread in front of Izuku's green muzzle. He took it between his teeth and got up to follow Bakugo as he turned towards the bathrooms at the rear of the first floor. "Hee, we all saw your junk, Midoriya," chuckled Mineta from between the girls, and Izuku bristled, gently dropped his slice of bread on the ground, turned and lunged at the great boy, snapping his jaws shut an inch from his face. The other students all sprung back while Mineta quaked in his slippers. Bakugo barked a laugh behind him, and Izuku turned back, picked up his bread and trotted ahead. Izuku was feeling uncomfortable about the idea of Bakugo washing him, but he continued to remind himself that as young boys they had bathed together if ever one stayed over at the other's house for the night, or if they got into a particular messy adventure during exploring or their play hero battles, and despite his annoyance at Mineta's words, he still had enough fur to keep himself decent. It's only the shortness of the little perv that had given him such an embarrassing vantage point. As it was, Izuku's shoulders came halfway up Bakugo's thigh, not as large as a wolf, but still a fairly large dog, and part of him was pleased at how Mineta had reacted to his threat. Bakugo ran some water to half fill a tub and grumbled about how he didn't have dog shampoo, so human would have to do, and Izuku just stood there watching his blonde friend pace around the room as he gathered towels and a cup to use to scoop water with, and so on. Izuku was more confused as to why the explosive blonde was handling the task before him so calmly. He knew now that the boy had a secret soft spot for animals, but not so much for Izuku himself. Bakugo saw Izuku just sitting there on the tiles watching him walk back and forth. "Well, get in the damn tub, flea bag!" he barked, and Izuku sat at attention and did what he was told, his legs long enough to step into the bath, and then he stood there, water part way up his legs, and looked back to Bakugo. Izuku had never washed a dog before and didn't know the process. Bakugo ditched the cup for a bucket and came back with it filled with water and tipped it onto Izuku. It was much colder than the water he stood in, and a squeak escaped his jaws which only made Bakugo smirk. "Now you're going to be a good boy and sit still." He glared, and Izuku decided he wasn't going to enjoy this experience. Bakugo had dried him roughly with the towels, and Izuku felt like his fur was sticking out in every direction by the time they left for class, the last ones out, and ran to class before the final bell rang. Bakugo took his normal seat and Izuku looked to his, huffed, and then settled to sit on the floor beside his desk, and classes began. Some of Izuku's classmates were kind enough to offer to take notes for him, seeing as he couldn't write anything and had to resign to only listening in, so he wagged his tail, closed his eyes and parted his jaw in what he hoped looked like a smile to them when they were being so kind. By the time lunch came around, Izuku was hungry, and he could hear Bakugo's stomach rumbling too from their lack of a proper breakfast. Uraraka called to Izuku from the door, asking if he wanted to have lunch with her, Ida and Todoroki, and although he wagged his tail at the thought, he stepped forward and looked up to Bakugo, who returned a scowl. "What the hell are you looking at me for?" growled the blonde. "Do what you want." He scoffed and rose from his own seat to leave. "Because Aizawa said I was your responsibility," Izuku wanted to say back with a frown, but went to meet Uraraka at the door as she smiled to him and reached down to pet his head between his ears. Izuku wondered if head pats felt this good as a human too. "Midoriya," called Aizawa as he approached them from the hall. One glance from the teacher was all the others needed to know that they should leave. "We'll get something for you from the cafeteria," spoke Todoroki as the three of them turned to leave down the hallway. Aizawa's face looked up to see Bakugo standing in the doorway behind Izuku. "Going to lunch?" pressed their teacher. "You said he's my dog," huffed back Bakugo in defiance, and with a tired sigh Aizawa ushered both boys back into the room and closed the door behind them out of habit. "Midoriya, do you think you could lead us back to where this happened?" he asked, and Izuku yipped a yes, or at least he hoped it would be taken as a yes. He couldn't nod his head so easily in this body without bowing his entire neck up and down, which just took more effort than it was worth, but he was prepared to do it if needed. Luckily they took his word for a yes. "Good, we will head there after classes are over for the day. I've also informed the principal and other faculty members, so you shouldn't encounter any problems while on campus," he concluded and went to leave, but when he opened the classroom door again there stood All Might in his weakened form and oversized clothes, about to knock. He blinked to Aizawa apologetically but rushed past him when his eyes fell to Izuku. "Young Midoriya!" he called and came down to his knees in front of him and pulled the large dark green dog into a tight embrace. Izuku wagged his tail, but it lacked vigor as he was saddened that he was like this to begin with. "Are you all right? Does anything hurt? You don't smell bad, at least," spoke up All Might with some surprise. He had heard from Hound Dog that although Midoriya did smell like himself, that he also stunk of garbage. "You're welcome," spat Bakugo with an eye roll. "Can we go get some damn food now?" He glared and Aizawa stepped out, leaving the doorway clear, and All Might looked to them both apologetically from where he still knelt on the ground. "You can both have lunch with me," offered All Might, not wanting to leave his student in such a state. "Don't want to," replied Bakugo with an irritated frown. "And Deku's friends are waiting for him." He nudged Izuku in the rump with his foot, not enough to hurt, but enough to get him to his feet and moving. He yipped at All Might and wagged his tail and then followed the explosive blonde from the room. The boys remained silent as they walked through the hallways to the cafeteria and then went their separate ways. Izuku wished Bakugo had stayed beside him because he was getting an awful lot of odd looks and whispers and gasps in his direction as he lowered his head and found his friends sitting at their usual table, which wasn't far from Bakugo's, but he had gone to get himself food. "Deku here," called Uraraka happily as she saw the large dog approach. Izuku knew already that he would be limited to sitting on the floor again, but his friends had removed a chair so at least he wouldn't be sitting in the walkway between tables. Uraraka pulled a tray from the table beside her and got off her chair to place it on the ground for Izuku to eat, and he was pleased to see his favorite meal, katsudon, before him. He dug in, restricting himself to small bites as it was a rather messy ordeal to manage and listen to his friends chat away. "You should have seen the looks people gave Todoroki, Deku," laughed Uraraka from the chair beside him, and she gazed down to him. "He was merely doing a friend a favor by also ordering Midoriya's lunch," argued Ida from opposite him. He could only see his legs under the table while he licked up the last of the rice. "I think they thought both were for me," offered Todoroki flatly and slurped another mouthful of noodles. "That's exactly what they thought," laughed Uraraka, and when she glanced down at Izuku again, who was now sitting up and could peer over the table, wagged his tail at her and received another delightful head pat. The final school bell rang and Izuku trotted after Bakugo as they headed to the front gates of the school campus to meet with Aizawa, who was already there looking as gloomy as usual. "Right," he said as they reached him. "Midoriya, lead the way." And he did. Izuku led them back down the hill the campus sat on and through the streets until he retraced his steps back to the small concrete courtyard behind the store. Izuku was several meters ahead of his classmate and teacher, as he had gone ahead to sniff out his own trail to ensure he was on the right path. His new sense of smell threatened to overwhelm him at times whenever an odd scent caught his attention, and he hadn't yet explored the full potential of his new nose. He could ignore most distracting scents when he came across them and was intrigued at how strongly he could pick out his classmates from scent alone. Bakugo smelt sweet like caramel that was on the cusp of burning. Uraraka smelt fresh and crisp like citrus. Ida carried a faint smell that reminded Izuku of petroleum, oil, and oranges. Todoroki's scent reminded Izuku of faint cedar wood and pine. And the list went on. His sense of hearing was also sharper, and that one was the most distracting of them all. A distant sound would distract him from the teacher's lectures and a sudden noise would frighten him, and he could do little against it. Even falling asleep the night before would have been more difficult if he hadn't been so tired from running around so much, as he could pick up all the little sounds outside far more clearly, and since he wasn't used to them, they were very distracting. "Back for another beating, huh?" He heard a loud voice in front of him as he followed his nose into the courtyard and came face to leg with the largest of the three men he had seen yesterday. The back of his neck bristled with fear as Izuku cursed himself for not paying close enough attention and getting too distracted with the scents around him. "We have to pay you back for tipping over our garbage yesterday," sneered down the tallest as he stepped up to block the alleyway. "What was that?" hissed Aizawa as he stepped up to the man with a threatening glare, and the man flinched away. Bakugo stood beside him looking pissed and ready for a fight. "That your dog?" barked back the large man. "So what if he is?" growled back Bakugo, lowering his stance, and Aizawa didn't attempt to calm him. "You just go around beating up people's pets?" he hissed. "Maybe you should keep your mud on leash then," retorted the large man, leaning forward to challenge Bakugo when a growl rose from Izuku's throat, and the man glanced down at where the large dog still stood. With his hackles raised, ears pulled back and his teeth on show as he growled threateningly, the two men backed away, but it didn't satisfy Izuku, and he lunged and snapped at their ankles with no intention of getting them, and the men hurried further back from them as Aizawa and Bakugo stepped deeper into the courtyard to flank Izuku. "That's enough, Midoriya," spoke Aizawa firmly, and Izuku shook himself to make his fur lie back down. Bakugo smirked, amused and pleased with Izuku acting so fierce. "What's the ruckus?" asked the final man as he stuck his head out the door to see what was going on, and it was Aizawa who turned to him and answered. "I believe there was an incident here yesterday that led to one of my students becoming this dog," offered up Aizawa with a gesture down to Izuku, and the man glanced down at him. "Yeah, this dog showed up here yesterday right after another one." "Wait, did you say student?" he asked with surprise. "You mean the kid from yesterday?" asked the taller man to the largest, and he shrugged back, but they looked shocked. "I see you have a security camera," pointed out Aizawa, and there was a small camera pointing from above the back door into the courtyard. "May we have a look?" But it wasn't a question. "Ah, sure, right this way," offered the man and held the door open for Aizawa to step inside. Behind them the metal-framed door shut heavily, and the rattling noise made Izuku flinch again and lower his head. Bakugo noticed and glared in the direction of the door. "Wait here, nerd," He ordered and stepped in the direction to follow Izuku and shot a warning glare at the remaining two men, but on second thought they decided to follow the boy in, leaving Izuku to sit and wait outside, a new scent catching his attention. Bakugo found Izuku and the man standing at a shabby, messy, paper-covered desk in a back room while the remaining two men continued on to the store floor. He peered over the teacher's shoulder, Izuku glancing back at him briefly before returning his own attention back to the screen. The man rewound that recording to yesterday, images flickering over the screen until he was satisfied and pressed play. The camera was at an angle that cut off the entry from the alleyway and the far corner, focusing itself from above the door and reaching to the far wall, but it was enough to see what happened. 3 figures clustered over a white dog, kicking it, but it was too weak to fight back or run away. Bakugo felt sickened at the behavior when all 3 men in the recording snapped their attention away and after some short time, left the courtyard to head back inside. Izuku came into view at that point, and went to help the dog which lashed out at him. He acted brave and ignored the bite, trying to make himself less of a threat to the large white dog which picked itself up and left. Finally the blurry image of Izuku on the screen stood up, staggered and fell back to the ground, writhing. The man watching was shocked, his jaw hanging open. The student's body thrashed on the ground and shifted and changed, and a green dog slipped out of the torn and discarded clothing, and the men returned moments later, kicking a disorientated Izuku in the side and pushing him out of frame. "I had no idea," spoke the man with shock. "There wasn't a sound." If Izuku had cried out when he had been able to, the men would have heard and rushed back out to see what was happening. Bakugo felt sick, not so much for Izuku changing, but that he had been kicked just like the other dog had, and he marched back outside before he decided to beat the 3 men the same way they had the dogs. Izuku's presence was the only thing that stopped him from doing it. Izuku had some more not-so-friendly words with the man before he stepped back out into the courtyard too, where Bakugo stood with his arms crossed as he watched Izuku pace the courtyard with his nose to the ground. "Here," spoke up the man again, having joined them, and handed them a backpack with clothing stuffed inside. "We found it left here, but the boy was gone," he explained as he handed the bag to Izuku, who nodded and turned his attention back to Izuku. The man took one final shocked look to the dog before ducking back inside. Izuku felt like he was close to something. He was trying to focus on the scents around him so much that he hadn't bothered to look up at Bakugo and his teacher when they had stepped back out, this time the door closing more gently when Bakugo caught it before it closed fully. He picked through the scents in the courtyard until he could pick one out above the rest. Seeing the 3 men again had allowed him to take in their scent and therefore focus on the one scent that didn't match up. The white dogs. If he could track down the one who did this to him, they would one step closer. "I don't think this needs to be said," spoke up Izuku loudly to bring Izuku's attention back to him, and he stopped his sniffing to look up to the gloomy teacher. "You are not to bite anyone. If a bite is what did this to you, we can't risk it affecting others." And Izuku dipped his head in understanding and returned to sniffing. "So now what?" grumbled Bakugo. "We find the white one?" he asked, looked back at the teacher. "That would be our best choice," replied Izuku with a sigh, and Izuku lifted his head again to yip at them, wanting their attention. When they both looked to him, he turned to head back through the alleyway, his nose to the ground to follow the white dog's scent, and the 2 followed behind. They turned left, the opposite direction to school, outside the alleyway, and followed the walkway around the corner and down another block as they followed Izuku's nose through the streets. He was so focused on finding the other dog that he didn't even notice people having to step out of his way and cursing down at him. Izuku paused. The scent trail turned left, but a fresher scent crossed back over it and crossed the street to his right, so fresh that it could have been less than an hour ago, and Izuku wagged his tail at the excitement of homing in on his quarry. The student and teacher behind him noticed this and perked up themselves, knowing that they were close to something that Izuku wanted to show them. They both hoped it was the white dog but couldn't know for sure. Izuku waited for the traffic lights to change to allow pedestrians to cross, and he trotted across the road with the other 2 lagging behind in his excitement, his tail still wagging. People parted for him as he walked along the walkway, shocked to see a dog so large strolling through town. He stopped occasionally to look back and check that Bakugo and Izuku, both with their hands stuffed in their pockets, were still following him at a more casual pace. The scent turned a right corner up ahead, but he picked up a whining noise around the corner and broke off at a sprint. Behind him Bakugo swore and took off after Izuku, Aizawa following suit more silently. But Izuku was faster than them both and rounded the corner first to see the large white dog being dragged into the back of a van lined with cages that was parked beside the walkway by two men armed with dog catcher poles. The second man, closest to Izuku, was maneuvering to hook his tool around the squirming dog's neck, and Izuku leapt at the man, lowering his head and hitting him like a furry battering ram. The man fell back, and his pole skidded further along the walkway. The other man swore, still trying to maneuver the dog into the van, and the white dog's blue eyes landed on Izuku's. The second man was getting back onto his feet, reaching for his pole. With a last burst of energy, the white dog pulled the pole free from its captor's grip and lunged for Izuku, reaching over him and digging its teeth into skin and fur on the back of Izuku's neck hard enough to make him yelp. With a solid grip, the white dog threw its body back, getting up on its hind legs and lifting Izuku back over its head and releasing him with enough force to fling Izuku onto the road, where he landed heavily, the wind being pushed out of him. Izuku staggered to his feet and turned his head in time to see a car moments away from hitting him, and with a sudden blast Bakugo landed a kick to his front, pushing him back to the walkway on the opposite side and his own momentum carrying the blonde out of harm's way. But it was a close call. The car screeched to a halt, and Aizawa rushing over to calm the panicked driver. The dog catchers pushed the white dog the rest of the way in and took off from the curb in a rush to get away. "You idiot!" spat Bakugo from where he stood between Izuku and the curb, and Izuku could only lower his head and whine pathetically when Bakugo turned his burning gaze to him. After the incident had passed and Aizawa had apologized to the driver, and they had moved on, he returned to the boys, one looking furious while the other looked miserable. "Are you hurt, Midoriya?" asked Aizawa, and Izuku got to his feet and limped closer to Aizawa, lowering his head and turning his body sideways onto the teacher. Bakugo's kick had aggravated Izuku's already aching ribs, and his paw had been twisted from the landing, but the back of neck stung and he whined up at the teacher until he knelt down to have a closer look. Aizawa felt through his fur, pulling back to report that there was no blood, and recovery girls should be able to fix up the bruising and aches for him. "Where the hell did those guys piss off to in such a hurry?" barked Bakugo. "That was the dog we wanted, wasn't it?" Izuku offered a yip as a yes. "They almost got you too, idiot," he growled down at the dog. "Didn't you see that guy coming up behind you? That white dog saved your ass." He scoffed, and Izuku dropped his ears again. "If it was so eager to help me, then why'd it bite me in the first place?" whined Izuku. "We can make some calls to the local animal shelters when we get back," spoke up Aizawa. "For now, let's head back," he said, still holding on to Izuku's backpack, and he turned to lead the way home. They made a stop on the way, as Aizawa had made a detour to stop at a pet store. The three of them entered, Izuku being assaulted by the many strong smells inside, and Aizawa told Bakugo to pick out a few items while he got others. One of the items Bakugo had been told to get was a collar, so Izuku would at least not look like a stray on campus and on the streets. Bakugo huffed over the task but waltzed down the aisles until he found the collar section and gazed across them. "Oi, nerd, come here!" he called. Izuku was already close by, sniffing around, and trotted over when he was called. His limp had mostly faded, and the twisted paw hurt less already, which he was grateful for. Bakugo smirked down at Izuku as he reached him, and he held up two collars, either of the to Izuku's liking. "Pick one," he demanded with an evil glint, and Izuku glanced over the choices presented to him. In Bakugo's right hand he held a bright pink collar, decorated with white frills and flower patterns, while in his left he held a plain black leather collar with a line of metal-pointed studs. He knew the black one was more for Bakugo's taste, so he reached out and touched it with his nose. Izuku would have much preferred just a plain collar overall, and he sat with his head lowered in defeat while Bakugo buckled it around his neck. Izuku was just happy he hadn't made it too tight. Aizawa returned to them with a freshly engraved dog tag with the name Midoriya on one side and two contact numbers on the rear, and he handed it to Bakugo to put onto the collar, Aizawa's eyes glancing at the collar with disapproval. "Why's my number on this?" asked Bakugo as he looked over the dog tag. "Because he's your responsibility. The other number is mine," answered Aizawa. "What's with the collar? He's already big enough, you want more people to be scared of him?" he asked with a sigh. "My dog!" spat back Bakugo, and he undid Izuku's collar to fix the tag to it, and Aizawa only sighed back. "Don't you think he will need anything else?" asked Aizawa as they moved from the collar section. "A lead perhaps, or something to chew on?" he asked over his shoulder. "I'm going to assume you don't want to eat dog food, Midoriya?" he asked, and Izuku let out a low rumble at the idea, which earned him a rare smirk from his teacher. "He's fine," answered Bakugo with an eye roll. "Pretty sure he's learned his lesson not to run off again." He nudged Izuku in the back of the legs with his foot to make his point, and Izuku glanced back at him with a huff. They picked out 2 large non-slip bowls on their way to the register, and Aizawa paid for the items and Bakugo fixed his collar back on. The 3 of them reached the school campus as Aizawa's phone buzzed, and he answered it without missing a step. "Yes?" he answered. "I see. Right away, we just got back." And the call ended. "Midoriya." He faced the dog as Izuku looked up to him. "Your mother is here to see you. We told her about your latest predicament this morning. Come with me. Bakugo, you can go back to the dorms now," finished Aizawa, pushing Izuku's backpack into Bakugo's hands, and he stalked away as Izuku followed Aizawa back to the main building. Izuku's mum was waiting for him in the principal's office with Principal Niza and All Might, and Aizawa bowed his head to them all politely as he entered, and Izuku rushed to be beside him mother, not wanting her to worry. She looked down to him with tears pricking her eyes and a handkerchief in her hand, having already been crying. "Oh Izuku, my baby!" she crooned as she got to her knees and wrapped her arms around her son and cried. Izuku wagged his tail trying to show her that he was alright and gave her a comforting friendly yip, and she pulled herself away and sat back in her seat. "Did you find anything out today?" asked Niza with a smile, always unfazed by these kinds of quirk accidents. Midoriya led us back to where the incident occurred. It appears that he was trying to help another dog that was being abused and got bitten, changing him into a dog himself. Midoriya tracked down the dog that had bitten him, but it was taken away by dog catchers before we could get to it. I plan to make some calls to find which shelter it's been taken to," Aizawa reported with his usual tired monotone. "You believe that dog had a quirk?" asked Izuku's mother, her voice strained as she still petted Izuku by her legs and the dog rested his chin on his mother's knees. "Or it's someone with a quirk that allows them to become a dog," spoke up Niza from across his desk. "Turning others into dogs too could just be another aspect of the quirk." "So it will wear off soon?" she asked desperately. "Most likely," answered Aizawa. "But we will continue to track this lead as well." And with nothing else to discuss other than some minor details, Izuku's mother left, Izuku walking with her as far as the gate with All Might and Aizawa, said their farewells and walked with the boy back to his dorm. Izuku's mother was happy for him to stay at school while this episode was ongoing and had scolded him about being more careful in general. The 2 teachers left the boy outside the front of his dorm after a quick visit to Recovery Girl, who had only shaken her head at the dark green furred dog, but he didn't go inside. Izuku waited until the teachers were gone before skulking back into the trees to relieve himself again. Holding it for so long was becoming uncomfortable, but he wanted to avoid further embarrassment. "This sucks," he whined internally and would have cried if he could, instead leaning his head back instinctually and howling into the night. The doors of the dorm had been locked, so Izuku had to sit at the door and bark for somebody to let him in. Cyril was the one to open the door. "Welcome back," he grinned as Izuku trotted in. "Yo, dude!" "Sick collar," chimed in Kirishima as he spotted the black-studded collar and came over to check it out. Several others gathered around him to inspect it and chuckled at his little dog tag. "You're like the class's mascot," chuckled Kaminari. "He could be our pet," giggled Hagakure. "Move it extras!" barked Bakugo over the crowd. "Deku, come here!" he called, and Izuku squeezed his way past his classmates to follow Bakugo's voice to the kitchen. The blonde was currently finishing up cooking a meal. Although the school provided them with all their meals, the students were still free to make their own food when they wanted, and tonight Bakugo had decided to cook. Usually something that caught the interest of most of their classmates, as just about everyone enjoyed his cooking. It required an especially good mood though for Bakugo to cook for anyone else. "Here," he said firmly, and placed a large stainless steel dog bowl on the ground filled with rice, vegetables and cooked meat. Izuku practically drooled over the bowl and gave Bakugo one final glance. "Well, don't just stare at me, fucking eat it," he barked, and Izuku tucked in, savoring the food. Nothing beat food made by Bakugo. Why didn't we get some?" whined Kaminari as he trailed into the kitchen. "What makes you think I'd cook for you?" scoffed Bakugo as he took a mouthful of his own bowl between cleaning dishes. "Come on, just a bite," pleaded Kaminari, inching closer to Bakugo's bowl. "You want some so fucking bad, share with Deku," barked Bakugo, snatching up his bowl and taking a big mouthful. Kaminari turned to glance down at Izuku. He was tempted. "Midoriya," he pleaded and inched closed. Izuku rose his head, seeing the blonde creeping closer, and he bared his teeth with a snarl, and Kaminari retreated. Bakugo laughed. The other students kept their distance, and returned to sharing study tips or chatting away in the lounge. Izuku licked his bowl clean before looking up to find Bakugo leaning on the counter staring down at him thoughtfully, and Izuku tipped his head to the side curiously. "Don't do that," scoffed Bakugo at the cuteness of Izuku's head tilt. Izuku tilted his head the other way, not understanding. "I said stop," barked Bakugo, but a small smile on the corner of his mouth gave him away, and Izuku sat, still curious. "If you're like this much longer, may have to look at changing your diet or adding something extra to it to better suit a dog," thought Bakugo aloud, his hint of a smile gone, and Izuku had nothing to add to that, so he just sat in silence, averting his gaze so he wasn't staring at the boy. Bakugo left to shower, and Izuku wandered over to his classmates clustered on the couches. They greeted him warmly with pats and more remarks on his collar. The girls were all together on the one couch, and Hagakure leaned over and must have whispered something into Jiro's ear, who smiled and then repeated the whisper to Yaoyorozu, who beamed at their words. "Hey Midoriya, come over here," waved Jiro with a cheerful smile, and Izuku got up from his seat on the floor between Todoroki and Siro's legs and went over to them, all of the girls beaming at him, and the closer he got the more he started to think he shouldn't. When Bakugo emerged from his shower and stepped back into the lounge area, he glanced around for his dog before he spotted him on the furthest couch, surrounded by the girls, and he walked over to see what was up. Izuku looked like he was in heaven, his head raised, eyes closed and tail wagging. "What the hell are you extras doing to my dog?" glared Bakugo as he reached the couch, but he didn't need to ask. He could see that Yaoyorozu had produced a pair of dog's slicker brushes, and the girls were currently grooming Izuku, making his coat less shaggy and into a more fluffy one. Izuku was enjoying the sensation of his back and sides being brushed so much that he hadn't noticed Bakugo. "We thought he would look cute all fluffy after a brush," beamed Uraraka as she brushed Izuku's left side, Hagakure brushing his right. "Wait, did you just call him yours?" smirked Jiro from beside Yaoyorozu as they sat on the couch behind Izuku, flanked by Ashido and Tsuyu, who were both less keen on dogs. "Yeah, what of it?" challenged Bakugo, and Izuku finally opened his eyes to see him, and gave the boy an excited yip, wanting to show him how good being brushed felt. Bakugo ignored him. "Aizawa-sensei said he was my responsibility," he replied. "Plus I've always wanted a dog." He smirked, and Izuku didn't know how to feel about that last remark and expression. "All right then," chuckled Jiro as she leaned back against Yaoyorozu, and Bakugo scowled at her. "That explains the collar then," laughed Sero from behind, and Bakugo huffed with irritation. "Whatever, I'm going to bed, so keep it down." He snapped at the rest of the class and turned away. "Deku, come!" he called back as he stalked away, and Izuku whined, not wanting the brushing to end, but a glare over Bakugo's shoulder made him move. He yipped a thanks to the girls, turned to gently take a brush from Uraraka's hand, which surprised her, wagged his tail and ran to catch up to Bakugo. Izuku was still preening from his grooming session, and didn't notice till they were at Bakugo's door if the boy intended for him to go in with him. Bakugo opened his bedroom door and stepped in while Izuku stayed outside, looking back at the elevator's door closing behind them, wondering if had made a mistake. Bakugo had probably told him to piss off, and he just hadn't noticed. "Oi, Deku, hurry up!" barked Bakugo, and despite his confusion he stepped over the threshold. "Shut the damn door!" ordered Bakugo as he pulled out his desk chair to sit at his desk, switching on the desk lamp. Izuku turned and gently nudged the door shut with his head, and then sat at the door uncomfortably. Bakugo leaned over his homework silently as Izuku crept deeper into the room and sat down beside Bakugo's bed. Izuku dropped the brush by his paws as holding something in his mouth too long made him drool. He couldn't think of any other reason Bakugo would bring him to his room other than to have him around while they slept. Not that Izuku minded, though it was a little uncomfortable, and for once he was glad he was a dog. Sitting in silence would have been more awkward as a human, plus in this form he wouldn't get stuck blushing or sweating or stammering, fumbling over his words. It was somewhat peaceful, and Izuku laid down against the bed frame with a long breath as he relaxed. Eventually Bakugo leaned back in his desk chair, stretching his arms over his head. Done. He turned off the lamp and tucked in the chair and stepped over Izuku to lay on his bed. Izuku lifted his head as Bakugo moved, but the boy didn't look to him. He let out another long breath, sad that he had given up being brushed for this. "Deku, can you get the light?" asked Bakugo, his voice too soft to be a demand, but Deku got to his paws and went to the door, putting a paw against the wall to lift himself up and flicked the switch with his nose before coming back to return to his warm spot on the floor by the bed with another long huff. He lowered his head onto his paws when he felt a touch between his ears. Bakugo had gotten under his covers and closed his eyes as he laid on his back in his bed, but slung an arm off the bed, feeling the fur of Izuku's head and touched it lightly with his fingers. The touch relaxed Izuku and he felt it wasn't so bad anymore, although it still didn't beat a proper pat or being brushed. Izuku fell asleep to the gentle touch atop his head, thinking of Bakugo's odd behavior. Maybe he did just really want a dog, he wondered as he dozed off. Izuku shot awake in the middle of the night, a sound waking him and his heart racing, but when he listened more closely he couldn't hear the sudden sound that had woken him again among all the other nocturnal sounds in the trees bordering the dorms. He knew he had nothing to fear, but he still wasn't accustomed to his stronger hearing. He looked to Bakugo for reassurance and found the boy already laying on his side, eyes open and facing Izuku. His sudden movement must have woken his blonde classmate, and he lowered his head and ears in apology. But Bakugo didn't seem mad and simply reached a hand out to Izuku, petting the top of his lowered head and moving his hand to rub his cheek when Izuku raised his head. The touch was a welcome distraction and slowed his heart rate, and Izuku closed his eyes, leaning into it. "I think I'll miss the brushing and the pats the most when I'm back to normal," Izuku thought to himself almost sadly. As a human, no one just comes over to pat your head. That was something the closest of friends or romantically involved couples would do, but as a dog, everyone just reached out whenever they felt like it, and it was bliss. Even grumpy Bakugo couldn't resist petting him as a dog. The tip of his tail wagged at the thought. Bakugo woke to his alarm beeping. It was 5:30 in the morning. Admittedly, Bakugo wouldn't do it every day, but on most he would get up for a jog before the sun rose and he had the place to himself. Izuku was already up and stretched downward dog style with a large yawn, brandishing all of his teeth in the gloom. More than once Bakugo had glimpsed Izuku up and training or exercising in the morning, but the nerd only did it if he happened to wake up for some reason. He wasn't as strict on it as Bakugo. Izuku trained mostly in the evenings, Bakugo in the mornings. Bakugo got out of the bed, Izuku moving away and sitting closer to the window to save Bakugo stepping over him. "Go back to sleep, nerd. You don't have to get up," grumbled Bakugo as he flicked the light on and opened a drawer to pull out clothes to change into. Izuku looked to him and made a small noise that was somewhere between a whine and a grumble. "Turn away," barked Bakugo when he had collected his things. "Peek and I'll kick your ass." Izuku obliged by turning so his back was to the blonde. He didn't look back again until he heard the bedroom door open, and he got to his paws to follow. "I told you to stay," said Bakugo, standing in the doorway and glaring back at the large green furred dog. Izuku huffed and lowered his head, stepping forward and pushing Bakugo forward with it. The blonde naturally dug his heels in, gripping the door frame and snarling. "What the hell, Deku?" he grumbled through gritted teeth. Izuku only stopped to look up at him. Bakugo stared down with narrowed eyes, either blinking. Bakugo broke first. "Fine," he huffed, and let go of the door frame and closed the door behind them once Izuku had stepped out into the hall. Jogging was more fun with the dog, Bakugo decided. Having a silent companion jogging beside him was nice. "Ha, bet if we did this like normal, no quirks allowed, I'd beat your ass," scoffed down Bakugo, still with plenty of vigor. Without missing a step, Izuku looked up to the boy with a challenge before he picked up the pace. The plus side of being a dog, he was fast quirkless. "Oh, it's on!" smirked Bakugo and matched him. This went on until even Bakugo's quirk got involved. Luckily the tracks Bakugo followed were well away from the dorms, and he lifted his legs and blasted himself forward to keep pace with Izuku, who was loving every moment of it. He felt so alive in this body. He did as a human too when he used his quirk, but there was something about running on all fours with such natural-born stamina that felt so freeing. Judging from the grin plastered to Bakugo's face, he was enjoying the challenge, but Izuku wanted to feel more and he dove off the track, Bakugo's eyes following him, and he ran parallel to the track, dodging, jumping and weaving with an unknown grace that made his mouth open as he panted in the crisp morning air. Eventually the two boys ran out of steam, and Izuku stepped back onto the track, head hanging low as he heaved in deep breaths. Bakugo was crouched down, doing the same. They hadn't set an end point for their race, and both had slowed with the other until they eventually both came to a stop. They rested for a few minutes before heading back at a more sustainable pace. Back at the dorms, Bakugo left his shower, another upside to being a dog, no sweat. Izuku stuck around in the kitchen while his classmates slowly started to stir and venture down for their breakfast and the prepare for the day, most giving him a pat as they passed. "Today's exercise will be search and rescue," announced Izawa once everyone was lined up inside ground beta. "You will be splitting into 3 teams. Your team's role will be decided after Yaoyorozu, Bakugo, and Todoroki. You 3 will be team captains and will take turns choosing team members. Go," he finished, and if he hadn't been at a training ground, would have retreated into his sleeping bag right then and there. The 3 chosen team captains stepped forward to stand before the line of remaining students, and Yaoyorozu offered a quick game of rock, paper, scissors to decide what order they choose in. "Do whatever, I'll win even if I pick last," scoffed Bakugo. "You mean your team?" offered Todoroki, but Bakugo didn't even bother reacting to him. Todoroki himself wasn't fussed and allowed Yaoyorozu to choose first. Yaoyorozu chose Jiro and Todoroki chose Kirishima, mostly to push Bakugo's buttons, but he only smirked when it was his turn, unfazed. "I choose Deku," he called loudly, and the line of students looked back. Behind them, sitting beside All Might and Midnight, who were supervising the exercise, was Izuku, and even he straightened with surprise as he was to be excluded from all class activities, for obvious reasons. "Young Bakugo," started up All Might. "I don't think dash." "Why not?" smirked Bakugo. "He's still part of the class, plus he's not useless like that." Izuku wanted to cry happy tears at his words. Not useless, such praise. "Fine, do what you want," sighed Izawa. "It's up to Midoriya though," he added, and at the words Izuku was on his feet and ran to Bakugo's side, sitting down beside him. He couldn't help his tail wagging with the joy of being included. And it went on until the teams were decided. Team 1 Heroes, Yaoyorozu, Jiro, Aoyama, Hagakure, Kaminari, Shoji, Ishido. Team 2 Rescues, Todoroki, Kirishima, Azuri, Ida, Uraraka, Koda, Sato. Team 3 Villains, Bakugo, Midoriya, Tokoyami, Siro, Wajiro, Mineta. Mineta complained about being the last one picked, of course. Heroes, your goal is to rescue all of the rescue victims from the area before time runs out. Rescues, you will be given bandages to represent injuries. You cannot use those injured limbs. You have 10 minutes to hide yourselves among the buildings and either wait for the heroes to rescue you or get yourself out. You are permitted to use your quirks for self-defense only, glared Izawa. Villains, your goal is to take out all of the heroes before they rescue the injured or to kidnap the injured for yourself. He gave his students one final glance over. Rescues, go see All Might and Midnight to get your bandages and head out. After 10 minutes, heroes and villains will go to their designated spots and wait for the buzzer. And with that, Izawa finally walked away to lean against the wall and rest. Izuku thought it was a very interesting twist on their usual search and rescue exercises. The rescues could save themselves by crawling out of the rubble and signaling a hero, but a villain could see them just as easily, and even just capturing one rescue would allow the villains to win over the heroes once time was up, but taking a hostage would require them to be guarded. One major problem with their team, though, they were lacking someone with a quirk that allowed them to search. Izuku knew that once given their roles to play, Bakugo would have known this and be pissed. But when he gazed up, his spine tingled when he saw Bakugo was smirking down at him with victory in his eyes. Bakugo and his team had taken up their position ready for the exercise to begin. What's the plan? Grinned ᴘᴅ with his hands on his hips as he directed his question to their team leader. We win, retorted Bakugo as he did a final stretch. ᴘᴅ's face dropped behind him, but Bakugo didn't notice it. Perhaps we should focus our efforts on capturing the injured to hold hostage, offered Tokoemi, who didn't look thrilled about the exercise, but he very rarely did. But then we have to guard them, whined Mineta. The hero team will come after us for sure. It's wiser than trying to take out the heroes. Even if we took some down, if they rescue all of the rescue team, they still win. We could do both, offered ᴘᴅ again with a smile to his teammates. Are you dumb? Piped up Mineta. We already have one less team member than the rest of the teams. It would be stupid to split up. He has a point, sighed Tokoemi. Shut it, extras, spoke up Bakugo, finally turning back to face them. Their starting point was on the first floor of one of the many damaged buildings. Birdbrain and Tail, you'll both stay here and protect the hostages. Deku and Tape Arms, you'll find the rescue team and bring them back. I'll take out the heroes and keep them busy, ordered Bakugo firmly with a glare, daring anyone to challenge him. Izuku had been watching on with concern, his head going from one boy to the next as they spoke. What about me? Spoke up Mineta, offended. You stay here too, glared Bakugo. Izuku gave a low bark of complaint. Fine, he scoffed after staring off Izuku. You go with the mutt, added Bakugo, changing his mind. How are they supposed to find them? Asked Wajiro. He's a dog. Duh, scoffed Bakugo in response, throwing an arm in Izuku's direction, and said dog was starting to feel the pressure. He's got a nose. Use it. When no one else spoke up in complaint to challenge their team leader, they started to discuss strategies with each other. The two staying behind, deciding where best to put their hostages and so on. Then the buzzer went off and it was game on. Tokoemi and Wajiro went deeper into the building to choose the best site they could to guard, while Bakugo turned to Izuku. Don't screw up. He spat with a smirk and took off, running away from the building to not give away their position before he blasted into the air to hunt the heroes. The remaining boy's eyes turned to Izuku, and he gulped under the pressure. Well? Asked Mineta, and Izuku picked the same direction Bakugo went and followed at a run. ᴘᴅ used his tape to give him momentum to keep up while Mineta cried out, unable to keep pace, and they turned back with a sigh to get him. Izuku had felt Bakugo had very much misplaced his faith in him to begin with, but as they got deeper among the buildings of Ground Beta and could hear Bakugo's blasts in the distance as he no doubt encountered the hero team, Izuku's nose picked up a familiar scent, and he followed it towards its source, his companions keeping low and to the shadows as they skirted the buildings. Uraraka made for a poor injured to be hostage when she burst into laughter upon seeing the villains approaching her. Mainly a small grape boy riding on the back of Izuku like he was his own noble steed, holding onto his collar like reins. Ha, we have you now, boasted Mineta, and Izuku could only hang his head in shame, which only made Uraraka laugh harder. She had the unfortunate fate of having bandages wrapped around both of her legs to indicate that she couldn't use them, and she didn't resist as ᴘᴅ bound her hands together, still snickering. ᴘᴅ whisked her away back to their villain lair, and Izuku moved on, following his nose to the next closest rescue team member, Minato refusing to get off of him even when he shook himself. "Keep that up and I'll stick some of my balls to you," threatened Minato, and Izuku didn't have to see him to picture his filthy grin. Izuku growled back, the most menacing growl he had mustered yet, and he thought he could feel Minato flinch. "Ah, come on, I can't keep up with you otherwise," he whined, and Izuku huffed, still annoyed, but continued on, following his nose to their next hostage-to-be. Izuku picked up the scent of Azuri, but as he crept into the darkness where her scent lingered, he was suddenly glad for his new animal senses. He was aware that Azuri could camouflage herself, and he followed his nose to its strongest source, peering up a wall with a knowing growl, pleased with himself. "What the hell are you growling dash?" A tongue whipped out and slapped at Mineta's face, throwing him from Izuku's back as Azuri went on the attack. The rules were that she could use her quirk in self-defense and, in this case, to prevent her capture. As far as Azuri was concerned, it was one down and one to go. In the gloom, Izuku couldn't see any bandages giving her position away, which could only mean that she was uninjured and could defend herself with her full strength. Her tongue whipped out again with frightening speed, visible with such movement, but Izuku leapt and pushed himself off of the wall to create some distance, but he was stumped. Without Minato or Shiro to capture her, and with Aizawa's warning to not use his teeth for risk of turning someone else into a dog, other than throwing his body weight around, there wasn't much he could do. Again her tongue lashed out, and Izuku's first instinct was to bite, but he fought it, ducking down low and feeling it whip up a breeze as it passed over the fur on his back. "Think," he demanded of himself, "Kaken has faith in me." He racked his stupid dog brain for an idea, and then he heard Minato stir further away, getting back up from his smack to the face. Izuku ran for him, leaping over another whip and skidded to a halt by Minato, scraping his paws, but scooped up the back of Mineta's costume in his jaws and spun to run to the opposite end of the space where rubble had built up. Minato screamed in his jaws, and squirmed, Izuku growling at him to stop hitting him. He just had to hope that the smaller boy would act on his own. With his keen nose and hearing, Izuku had a good idea of where Azuri was positioned on the wall, and as he reached the pile of rubble at the far end, he coursed up it, leaping from one point to the next, before he almost reached the ceiling and turned, launching himself off of the peak and flying towards the spot he thought Azuri was at. Minato seemed to catch on and stopped squirming, instead reaching up to grab one of his sticky purple balls in each hand, holding them forward. Figuring her position was blown for sure, Azuri tried to move away without disrupting her camouflage, but not fast enough, and still came into reach of Mineta's balls, and as she moved he saw her and latched onto her back. As gravity took over, Izuku held onto Mineta's clothing, letting his body weight and momentum drag Azuri from the wall, and the three of them fell to the broken concrete together. Izuku landed awkwardly on his legs, letting out a yelp from the sudden shot of pain, Minato falling from his grip, and Azuri tried to run, Minato still holding onto her as her full form came back into view. Izuku ignored the pain and lunged, using his weight and all four paws to pin Azuri down under him. Minato rolled out from between them regretfully, and Izuku lifted his lips and bared his fangs down at her face, parting them slightly with a deep growl, and Azuri looked terrified. Izuku remembered too late that she wasn't a fan of dogs. All right, I surrender," she croaked in a higher pitch, and Izuku stepped off, lowering his ears and whining in apology. He had gotten carried away with the moment, and scared his friend. She tried to give him a reassuring smile, but it fell flat, and Izuku lowered himself to his belly, trying to express how sorry he was. "It's fine, Midoriya," she croaked normally. "You are very intimidating like this." And Izuku's ears lifted a little. He kind of liked hearing that, but he also didn't want his friends to be scared of him. Minato returned from where he had been digging through the rubble with a bent metal pipe. It was bent perfectly to attach to the two balls on Azuri's back, creating a handle. Azuri didn't look impressed. Izuku felt embarrassed while Minato beamed at his own genius. Minato climbed back onto Izuku's back, which he grumbled about. "Onwards," he declared, and Izuku let his head drop, stepping forward to pick up the metal bar in his jaws, lifting Azuri, who brought her limbs in to be carried away as a neat little package. It was embarrassing for all those involved except Minato. Asuy was on the lighter end of the students of her size, thankfully, and it wasn't much strain for Izuku to carry her as he stepped back outside, checked both ways were clear before he headed down the street at a run, keeping to the sidewalks for better cover as he hurried back to their base. "Here, it's Midoriya!" called a voice from above, and Izuku didn't have to look back to know it was Ishido who had spotted him from the roof of a building in the street. What he hadn't known was that she was up there with Aoyama, who said something frilly in French that Izuku didn't understand before a bright beam struck down and cut off his path. He jumped to the side to go around when another shot was fired, and he had to skid to a halt. His poor paws. He took off again, darting to the other side of the street to be at a more difficult angle for Aoyama to strike from. Izuku started to think they were in the clear. No one on the hero team were well suited for a chase. Shoji leapt out from an alleyway ahead, arms outstretched to encircle them all, and there wasn't enough time or space to stop or change direction. Izuku tried to stop, scraping his paws further, as their momentum carried them forward. Minato gave out a war cry and tore at his head, leaping from Izuku's back to land his grape-like balls to Shoji's face. The multi-limbed man's first instinct was to reach for Minato to protect himself, but with so many arms he reached out for Izuku at the same time. Body still sliding, Izuku dropped as low as he could, hearing Asuy cry out in complaint, and he did his best to not let her body scrape by reaching his front paws forward to keep her from the ground. It wasn't going to be enough, though. There was an explosion from behind, knocking Shoji forward, lifting his arms enough for Izuku and Asuy to pass freely below. Bakugo sneered from behind, his boot pressed to Shoji's back as he pushed him forward, and he reached forward to tear Minato from the startled hero's grip before pushing off and landing on the sidewalk. He smirked dangerously down to Izuku, who was panting through his teeth. Minato leapt for Izuku's back again, and Bakugo's smirk dropped as he took in the odd sight. With no words to speak, Izuku's green eyes reached Bakugo's for a moment before he turned away and ran with everything he had towards his goal. He heard Bakugo scoff with amusement before more blasts could be heard, but Izuku didn't look back. He had full trust in Bakugo's ability to keep the hero team off his back. He was almost at their base with no sign of anyone getting past Bakugo when Izuku ran into Siro, who smirked at what he saw. Izuku dropped Asuy, and she swayed on her feet as she stood, looking a little green from the movements. Siro agreed to take her the rest of the way back, taping her hands together. Asuy was just happy to be standing on her own feet again. Izuku turned back around, not caring if Minato was with him or not, which he was, and ran back to where he had last seen Bakugo in the street. He knew there were more hostages up for grabs and that their explosive team leader would prefer a complete victory, but Izuku doubted there was much time left at all. The other way he knew Bakugo always wanted to win was with zero losers on his side, otherwise he wouldn't have bothered getting Minato back. Izuku raced through the streets, listening for Bakugo's blasts and homing in on them. Finally he rounded a corner. "You're not jumping into that, are you?" quaked Minato at the sight before them. It was majority of the hero team against Bakugo. He used his blasts to dodge the group's attacks, and a sling catapult from Yaoyorozu made it so he couldn't gain altitude. He was closed in from all sides and was feeling enough pressure to lose his cocky smirk, and instead was replaced with a frustrated sneer. Izuku's hackles rose as he saw his owner in peril, and he felt the urge to dive in and support him. He let out a low growl before he charged forward. Minato pulled off some of his balls and started throwing them as Izuku closed in fast from behind. "Well?" called out Aoyama as a sticky ball landed on his elbow, and he turned to see. Izuku was on him a moment later, snapping at his ankles as he passed. The sparkling blonde reared back in alarm, and Minato took the chance to throw more balls at him, throwing Aoyama off balance more, and he fell over, sticking to the road. Izuku darted for the next closest enemy, Ishido, who upon hearing Aoyama's squeal, turned back and screamed when she saw the angry-looking dog charging for her. She resisted the urge to turn and flee, but instead crouched on the ground in fear, shutting her eyes tightly. Izuku felt bad and passed her without a growl or a snap. Minato had created a chain with his sticky purple balls and let it wrap around Ishido as they passed, trapping her. There was enough noise that Izuku had grabbed everyone's attention now, even Bakugo's, who looked surprised a moment before his cocky smirk came back. Kaminari turned his launcher towards Izuku and fired. Izuku dodged it easily as it latched to the ground behind him, but he knew what came next as Kaminari pointed a finger his way, sparks flaring up. When Izuku didn't divert his path, the boy allowed himself to look pleased. A blast later, Bakugo's boot was pressed to his face and the boy went flying across the street. It was an easy win from there and an embarrassing loss for the rest. Jiro and Hagakure were the only ones missing from the final brawl, having found the hiding place of the villains and their hostages and had been caught up in their own battle against Shiro, Tokoemi, and Wajiro. By the time the buzzer went off, Bakugo's team had won, taking out all of the heroes and capturing 3 hostages, Shiro having found timid Koda on his way back. The pair of hero girls, having been unable to get past the villain boys to reach the hostages in time. Overall, Bakugo was very pleased with his decision to put Izuku on his team. "Man, you should have seen him in person, he was so cool," Mayonetta told the group of students enthusiastically as they relaxed in the lounge after the school day was over. Most students had showered already, Bakugo had been one of the last of the boys to shower, as since he had already worked up a sweat during the exercise, he had done a workout afterwards too, just to top it off. Izuku sat among the students, his ears pulled back in what he thought looked like discomfort as Mayonetta carried on about Izuku's performance during the exercise. Bakugo smirked, glad that he could rub into everyone's face how good he was as picking his teammates, and showing them all up that a dog could beat them. "He was scary," chimed in Azui, and Ashido nodded beside her. Izuku lowered his head and whined at the girls' comments. "He was fierce," countered Mayonetta, and some of the other students agreed to that. "You're only saying that because you got to ride him like a horse," scoffed Shiro, and Iraruka laughed out loud, making others laugh with her as they recalled the sight. Even if they hadn't seen it, the exercise had been recorded for evaluation after, and they had seen it all then. "Maybe you're just jealous that none of you are small enough to ride him like a horse," scoffed Mayonetta. Bakugo had been standing off to the side, observing the interaction before he stepped forward. Kirishima spotted him and made room on the couch for him to sit beside, and at the movement Izuku looked up, spotted Bakugo slumping down on the couch, and his ears lifted, tail wagging, and he headed for him. He sat beside Bakugo's legs, and the blonde resisted the urge to pet him as some of the other students looked on with stifled laughs and smirks. "You did good picking Midoriya for your team today," smiled Kirishima, and Bakugo huffed. "Of course I did," he scoffed. "Not my fault the rest of you losers looked him over just because he's a dog." "But he's scary as a dog," whined Ashido from the far couch. "Midoriya could be scary sometimes even before he was a dog," laughed Kaminari, and Izuku's head snapped up to glare at the sparky blonde as the other students laughed and chimed in with their own account of when they thought Izuku had been a little on the scary side during exercises, or when someone spoke badly of one of his friends or something he was passionate about. Izuku wanted to hide his face and instead settled for laying down by Bakugo's slippered feet and putting a paw across his nose in embarrassment. Izuku was drooling by the time Bakugo put down his bowl containing his favorite meal, and he wolfed it down with his tail wagging. He took it to be Bakugo's way of saying that he did a good job today, and he was glad to take it. After dinner, Bakugo went back to his room, Izuku on his heels. Despite the change, day-to-day was starting to take on its own routine. Izuku would run with Bakugo in the mornings, wait for his friend to shower, eat a meal made by him, then go to class. Izuku no longer sat by his empty spot in the classroom but stepped forward to sit or lay by Bakugo's desk during classes. Izuku was able to join in on most training exercises thanks to Bakugo insisting that he could handle himself, which he could most of the time. He had some advantages now, but just as many disadvantages too, and no Quirk on top of that. Izuku would still sit at his usual table during lunch with his friends, but as each day went by he felt himself longing to be at Bakugo's side more and more. He would follow the explosive blonde almost everywhere he would go unless he turned and told him to stay, and Izuku would do just that, sit by the doorway and wait for Bakugo to return, although the only time they were apart was when Bakugo went to shower or use the bathroom, or for Izuku's case, when he ducked into the tree line to go. As the week went by, Izuku sometimes found his mind fading away like some kind of daydream, shaking his head to bring himself back to the here and now, but when he did, he would often find himself in embarrassing situations. Like the time the fog cleared, and he found he was on his back, getting his belly rubbed by children while he had been walking down the street with Bakugo to get groceries, or the time he had rested his head on Bakugo's knees demanding a pat only to receive a startled look from the blonde, or when Bakugo had exploded at him with rage when the boy had returned to his room from the bathroom, having gotten distracted by a conversation with Kirishima, to find Izuku had torn apart one of his pillows and scattered his room with fluff. And there was the time during a mid-morning run when he had halted to a stop to sniff at a tree and cocked his leg right in front of the confused blonde. That one had been especially embarrassing. "He's losing his mind!" shouted Bakugo, and Aizawa narrowed his eyes to him as he gazed from the hot-headed blonde to the dog by his side. Izuku held his ears back with concern. He had followed Bakugo to the teacher's dorm after dinner, and they had caught Aizawa as he was heading in. Izuku knew what Kaken was on about, he felt it, having no memory of doing those sorts of things, and they scared him too. At first it was only small moments, but as the days went by they were happening more frequently. "How so?" asked Aizawa with a flat tone. "He's acting more and more like an actual dog," hissed Bakugo back. Izuku yipped in agreement. The boys had checked in with Aizawa a couple of days or so to check the progress of finding the white dog, but Aizawa had called and visited every rescue in the city with zero luck. The staff reporting that no one had even brought in a dog matching his description, which was concerning. Without that lead, finding answers would take even longer, and Bakugo was starting to wake up each morning more disappointed than the last when he woke to find Izuku was still a dog. There was no indication that the quirk was going to wear off on its own, and with Izuku blacking out and behaving more like an actual dog, his concern only grew. Aizawa said he would handle it, and the next day when he met the boys again he handed Bakugo a bag before turning to leave, ignoring the boys' angry complaints. The blonde stalked back to his room with a concerned Izuku in tow, slamming the door behind him and dumping the bag's contents onto his bed. Inside there was a rubber ball, a chew toy shaped like All Might, a GPS tracking tag, a tug-of-war knotted rope toy, and some long-lasting treats. Bakugo's eye twitched at the items and his rage boiled over as he stormed out of the room to find his teacher, and for once Izuku stayed behind, not wanting to be involved in that scene, and instead he leaned up onto Bakugo's bed to sniff at the items more closely. Bakugo returned grumbling and froze in the doorway when he saw Izuku laying by his bed chewing on the All Might chew toy, and the blonde slammed the door behind him, bringing Izuku's attention back to him, and he lifted his head to face his owner as he stomped towards him, kneeling down in front of him and tearing the toy from his jaws and throwing it across the room. The boy's hands cupped each side of his face as he held the dog's gaze on him. "God damn it, Deku, you're a person, not a dog!" If Bakugo's voice cracked a little, he didn't care as he stared into Izuku's eyes, but the green eyes looked empty. Izuku himself looked to his owner with confusion. The sight before him lacked vibrant colors, but he couldn't understand the words, or why his owner seemed upset. The boy before him lowered his head and made sounds that Izuku knew meant he was sad. His owner's hands dropped from his face, and he took the opportunity to retrieve the toy that had been thrown, coming back to his owner and squeezing it between his jaws to make it squeak. Playing was always a good way to feel better, but his owner didn't lift his head, so Izuku went for his next idea, dropping the toy and leaning in to gently lick at the boy's cheek. That got his attention, and the boy's face shot up, tears in his eyes, and he shoved him away angrily. He rose to his feet, towering over Izuku, and barked something down to him, but he didn't know the words. But he knew he had angered the boy and lowered his head in submission. "I'm sorry," came words to Izuku's mind, and like a cold drop of water had touched bare skin, he was suddenly aware of his surroundings again. Vibrant colors returned and he gazed around, his eyes locking on to Kaken, who was staring down at him with an enraged snarl, but his eyes were wet with tears. Had he done something to upset his friend? He yipped to him, his green eyes filled with concern and his ear half lifted, waiting for something, anything. Bakugo's expression softened, and he lowered himself to his knees slowly, and Izuku tentatively stepped forward until he was close enough for Bakugo to reach out, wrap his arms around the large dog's neck and pulled him in close, embracing him. The behavior was so strange that Izuku tensed up, but it felt like it was something the blonde needed, so he relaxed and rested his chin on Bakugo's shoulder. If something happened while Izuku was blacked out, Bakugo didn't say. He held him there for a few minutes before he finally stood and tried to go on like everything was normal. The blonde stuffed the things Aizawa had gotten for him back in the bag and shut them in the closest. The only item he kept out was the GPS tag, which he attached to Izuku's collar beside his ID tag. That night Izuku crept up onto the bed beside Bakugo and curled up on top of the covers. He worried that Bakugo would get mad at him, but he felt that he should stay close, and the boy must have woken during the night because when Izuku woke to a sound in the early hours of the morning, Bakugo's arm was draped over him. Izuku was pulled from participating in exercises after an incident during mid-battle where he blacked out and, feeling threatened, had tried to bite one of the students. Luckily it had been Kirishima who escaped the encounter unharmed, but if most of his classmates weren't scared of him before, some were now, keeping their interactions with him minimal, or avoiding him altogether. Izuku had felt so ashamed of the incident that he stopped following Bakugo to class from that day onwards and instead would spend his afternoons lazing around the dorms. Before his classmates would return at the end of the day, he would duck into Bakugo's room, or he would push his way out of the front doors and disappear into the surrounding forest to be away from everyone else until Bakugo returned. Bakugo kept him close despite the incident, although Izuku caught him staring his way with concern more than once, which made him divert his gaze. Kirishima acted unfazed about the incident, and aside from Ishido, most of Bakugo's friends hung around like nothing had changed. Kaminari would keep his distance, but he still made an effort, which Izuku appreciated, but he could feel the class's tension whenever he was around. Izuku had been a dog for 2 weeks by the time Bakugo gave in and retrieved his toys from his closest, handing the tug-of-war toy to Kirishima to use. He was trying to boost his classmates' view of Izuku, and he had fun playing tug-of-war with Kirishima in the front of the dorms on the sunny weekend, and it had some success, other students taking turns to test their strength against Izuku. It didn't escape his attention though that Bakugo didn't join in, and his saddened expression as he watched from the steps. Izuku's own closest friends tried to behave around him like everything was fine, but he could see through the cracks in their masks, Iruka especially. Some moments she would be close by, petting him between the ears and telling him a story from class, and others she would be trying to avoid his gaze, which stung. Todoroki seemed unfazed and acted the same around him, and Ida stayed strong and positive around him too, which was nice. Koda became the class's warning system for whenever Izuku blacked out, and became more like a real dog in mind. Whenever it happened, Koda could hear him, and the class would act accordingly. Some would leave, recalling how vicious he had been towards Kirishima that day, despite some of his classmates pointing out that he only reacted that way because of the situation he was in. Koda especially advocated that most animals only act violently when they are stressed, injured, feel trapped or threatened, but it wasn't much comfort for some. Meanwhile, others would take Izuku's mental slips as a chance to spend time with him like they would a real dog, rubbing his belly with their feet, playing fetch and other games, or taking him for a walk around campus on lead if they could take it from Bakugo's room without him knowing. One time Kaminari and Siro were giving him random scraps from the fridge, giggling about how they thought he would react when he learned he ate things he usually wouldn't touch. Bakugo had scolded them both severely for treating his dog like that. More than anything, Izuku hated the looks his friends gave him, torn between fear and concern for him. Even Bakugo's eyes showed it, and it made his chest ache. If he could cry, he would have cried himself dry days ago. It hurt so much that he was losing himself, and they all knew it. He understood now why the white dog had acted the way it had both times when he had encountered it. The first time it had been hurt and scared and had lashed out to protect itself. Izuku's own incident had been more severe than that. He had been clearly on the offensive when he had been scared of the situation. The white dog at the time had been too injured to act the same. The second time the dog had seemed more in its own mind and had done what it had to keep Izuku from the dog catchers. He wondered how long that person had been trapped in the body of the white dog before it had bitten him, and where it was now. Was it a real dog now, or did it still fight to remain human inside? Izuku started to wonder if it was even safe for him to be around anymore. Even if he had only had the one bad slip-up, if it happened again he carried more risk of harm than a usual dog his size. With a bite from him, he could make someone else turn into a dog too, like a slow-acting zombie apocalypse. Izuku had little success tracking down the white dog, and the school had gotten the police involved, broadening their search to similar quirks. They found someone over an hour's train ride away who had a quirk that allowed them to turn into a dog, but he had gone missing himself months ago, leading to another dead end. Izuku had taken Izuku unleashed to visit a local hospital during classes to have a check over and to speak to the attending doctor about ideas to escape the quirk. But any ideas they had didn't work, so instead they took some blood work and an MRI scan to investigate further. Izuku considered himself lucky that Izuku hadn't blacked out at all during the visit. Izuku's mom came to visit again, and despite the brave face she put on, in her eyes Izuku could see the same sadness and concern that everyone else looked to him with, and he looked away. He didn't want anyone to be so worried for him, so hurt about his condition, and after that he wouldn't look anyone in the eye again, even Bakugo and All Might. He just walked on with his head down or his gaze fixed straight ahead. He went about his days only seeing the legs of those around him as their colors became dull and their voices faded to muffled noise, only picking up the occasional word here and there. If his classmates were more concerned when he didn't look to them or react when they spoke to him unless they used key words he could pick up on, he didn't know, he didn't dare face them for fear of what he would see on their faces. Izuku went back to sleeping on the floor in Bakugo's room each night, his brief stint of creeping onto the bed over, not because his owner yelled at him to get off, but because he just didn't feel like he wanted to be close to anyone anymore. He even skipped out on some of their morning runs, refusing to lift his head when Bakugo spoke to him before he left. Bakugo himself had noticed the change in Izuku after what happened with Kirishima during battle practice, and it hurt his chest to watch as Izuku closed himself off and gave up on interacting with the world around him. Since day one, Bakugo had thought having Deku around as a dog would be fun. Imagine the buttons he could push when he was human again, and he would tell him how obedient of a pet he had been. He would smirk to himself just picturing how embarrassed, red-faced and flustered the nerd would get, but after several days had passed, he started to miss hearing the nerd's voice and their daily interactions. After almost a week of waking and hoping to find Izuku sleeping on his floor as himself, he was starting to grow more concerned. He enjoyed Deku's company, even as a dog, he enjoyed their jogs together, how happy he was when he fed him and how fierce and versatile the nerd was during class exercises. But after the incident his concerns started to turn to fear. Not fear of Izuku, but fear for him. He had noticed him slipping into moments where he behaved like a real dog, and each moment had made panic rise in the back of his throat as the moments grew longer and more frequent, and he feared that one day, Izuku may not snap out of it. Sure, he would gain the coolest dog ever, but he would lose his childhood friend, and that made his chest ache. Every time he approached his teacher with his concerns, he was good and would listen and reply rationally. Izuku would keep him up to date with their search efforts and informed him of how Izuku's hospital visit went, but it was less and less comforting as they kept coming up with dead ends and anxiety flared up in Bakugo's chest when he felt that they might be running out of time to save Izuku. Despite everything and as Izuku closed himself off from everyone else, he still stayed by Bakugo's side. He would creep onto his bed at night, and Bakugo would let him, enjoying his closeness, and he felt like Izuku needed it. Eventually Izuku stopped looking to him too, and it stung. Bakugo would try to talk to him, but it was like he couldn't hear him properly. Izuku would turn his way, but wouldn't react at all. He wouldn't look up to him anymore when he spoke, and one morning when Bakugo woke to find Izuku sleeping on the floor instead of his bed, it had hurt so much that he had to get up and go for a run right then, or he might burst. He was even more hurt when Izuku hadn't even made a move to follow him. He had run and cried in the pre-dawn chill until he couldn't anymore. He was losing his friend and he felt helpless to do anything about it. After that upsetting morning, Bakugo had showered and shaken it off as best as he could, checking in with Izuku, who seemed too depressed to get up even for breakfast. He made his favorite for breakfast and left it in his bowl on the kitchen floor for when Izuku did decide to get up and headed to class. He was certain that Kirishima had noticed his somber, less fiery mood this morning, but he was wise to not comment and instead just stuck close by throughout the day, making jokes and trying to get him to smirk at least. Bakugo at least felt a little more relaxed at the end of the day when he saw that Izuku had cleaned out his bowl at some point during the day. Where Izuku was now, he wasn't sure. He knew he wasn't in his room, and he was glad that he had put on the GPS tag. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and checked the app, seeing that Izuku was hanging around in the trees surrounding the dorm, and as long as he was close by, he didn't mind. It was a good app, and through it Bakugo could look into Izuku's travel history and see the route he had taken throughout the day and when he had returned to the dorms before ducking out again. He could also see that Izuku hadn't bothered to leave his bedroom until well into the school day. He had noticed how Izuku would leave the building before everyone came back, and it was clear that the green dog was avoiding everyone. Days before, Izuku would wait hidden in the tree line until he spotted Bakugo and then would come over and come inside with him, but for the last couple of days, he hadn't even been doing that. Tonight, Izuku wouldn't come back on his own until Bakugo had stood outside the dorms calling him in. He knew from the app that Izuku was close enough to hear him, and a short while later, Izuku came out from the trees and walked past him and into the dorm. Bakugo bit back his hurt that Izuku hadn't looked to him, hadn't stopped to wait for Bakugo to join him as they headed inside together. It hurt, and Izuku's depressing behavior was only making Bakugo feel more anxious and concerned. When the blonde stepped back inside, he asked where his dog had gone, and Kirishima told him that he had headed straight to the stairs without stopping for anyone who called, and Bakugo let out a long sigh and slumped his shoulders. "Dude, you alright?" asked Kirishima, getting to his feet and talking quietly as he came close. "I'm worried about the damn nerd," he replied under his breath. "He's definitely been off," commented Kirishima, and when Bakugo lifted his gaze to look to his friend, he could see the deep sadness and concern there, and he wondered if he looked the same. If even he looked like that, no wonder Izuku didn't want to look any of them in the face. Bakugo cursed under his breath, and Kirishima shot him a look, but he ignored it. When Bakugo went to bed later in the evening, he found Izuku already curled up on the floor by his bed. The large dog opened an eye as he came in, then closed it again when he saw it was Bakugo. The blonde dropped himself heavily onto the bed with a sigh and gazed down at his furry roommate, wondering what he could do about the situation, when he shifted slightly, and his foot nudged something tucked under the bed. Bakugo reached down to pull the item out, and saw it was the brush Yaoyorozu had made what feels like forever ago. With it in his hand, Bakugo felt he had a chance of getting through to Izuku. He slid off the bed to sit beside Izuku, who opened an eye in his direction again curiously, and Bakugo leaned forward to run the bristles through Izuku's fur, and the dog's head shot up, watching Bakugo's hand move. Izuku's green eyes lifted to Bakugo's, and the blonde smiled to the dog, causing the tip of its tail to wag. Izuku got to his feet, turned to face his spiky-haired friend, and then lowered himself again, his body pressed against Bakugo's leg as he began brushing again. He had spent so much time avoiding others that he had almost forgotten how good being petted felt, and brushing was even better. Izuku let out a long breath. He felt regret for being so cold to everyone, Bakugo especially. He hadn't wanted to see their concerned faces anymore, but he was just as much at fault. The more he distanced himself, the more concerned they had grown. He had been building up walls inside himself, but within a few seconds they crumbled back down as he leaned against Bakugo as he brushed him, and his heart felt lighter. That night, for the first one in many, Izuku slept on the bed beside Bakugo again, and both boys felt more relaxed from it. But the peace did not last. Bakugo shot awake as a crashing sound filled his room. It was still dark behind his curtains, and there was minimal light to see with, but his mind shot to Izuku. He moved to get up when he heard a deep growl coming from the space between him and the door. He froze, and as his eyes adjusted to the lack of light, he could see the outline of Izuku facing him. The large dog stepped forward, growl deepening, and he knew Izuku had faded out, that he wasn't Deku right now, but a large dog that had woken up in a small dark room. Bakugo backed away slowly, Izuku's growl becoming more intense, and he felt his mattress dip under him as the large dog stepped up to hover over him. Bakugo laid back down and tried to keep his breathing calm, knowing that any sudden move might be rewarded with a bite. As the large dog stood over him, he could glimpse the white of his teeth from the faint lamplight coming in through behind the curtains as Izuku's lips pulled back. No wonder some of the other students feared him, it was a threatening sight. The door burst open, and the room was flooded with light as Kirishima charged in, wrapping a hardened arm around Izuku's neck and pulling him back. Izuku snarled and snapped, but couldn't reach the boy holding him from behind, but the sight and sounds were terrifying. Shoji was next on the scene, but there was little he could do. Kirishima was the only one who could hold Izuku down without getting bitten. "Stop!" called Bakugo as he got up from the bed and followed the others out as Kirishima pulled Izuku to the hallway where there was more space. "He's scared." Kirishima looked up at his friend. Without having to say anything, Bakugo already knew that Kirishima was aware of that but was scared to let go. On the side opposite them, Uraraka and Ishido burst out of their rooms in their pajamas and slept on hair, ready for action, but then recoiled when they saw Izuku going feral. Suddenly Izuku calmed, his snarling and snapping stopped, and he went limp in Kirishima's arms. The red-haired boy instantly released him, and the others stepped closer, worried that Kirishima had gone too far and knocked the dog out. Izuku, breathing heavily, got to his feet and shook himself. When he looked up, he saw 5 concerned faces staring down at him with fear, and he pieced it all together, and his heart felt like it was going to stop. He had turned feral against one of the students again. It was the same shocked, fearful eyes he had seen during his last incident, and he knew it had been Bakugo this time. He backed away. "Deku," Bakugo stepped forward slowly and spoke gently, holding out a hand towards him, but he could see that Bakugo was breathing heavily, his eyes wide and it stung. Izuku backed away again, Bakugo taking a step forward to match. He turned on his paws and ran for the stairs. Bakugo called after him, but he ignored it and bolted down the stairs as fast as he could, passing squealing classmates who had woken from the commotion and were on their way up to see what the problem was. He ignored all of them until he burst out of the unlocked dorm doors and made a beeline for the trees. Bakugo had been on his heels, held back only for a second by Kirishima grabbing his arm, but he pulled himself free. It was enough time for Izuku to create distance between them, and he pushed past the students in the stairs, hissing at them to get the fuck out of his way. By the time he reached the bottom floor, he saw Izuku push his way out of the doors, and by the time he reached the doors himself, the dog was gone. Bakugo stepped out into the cold dark night and called out his dog's name repeatedly, but this time, Izuku didn't come back. By the time Bakugo had turned on his heel to race back up to his room to grab his phone to track Izuku, the entire dorm was awake, and they bustled around on the 4th floor, asking questions, and he pushed past them, ignoring them. But by the time he reached the bottom floor again, Aizawa was there, and he held up a hand to make him stop. Kirishima had escaped the barrage of questions upstairs and joined Bakugo when Aizawa demanded to know what happened. Bakugo tried to tell him that he didn't have the time, that he had to find Deku, but Aizawa wouldn't let him pass until he calmed down and explained. After he finally did, Kirishima joined in with his account, and by then the entire class was down on the main floor with Ida shouting at them all to get back to bed. "Come with me," spoke Aizawa in his same flat tone. "The rest of you get back to bed," he ordered more loudly to the rest of the students, and they complained and carried on but turned to leave. "You too," spoke Aizawa to Kirishima, who had stayed at Bakugo's side. He glanced to Bakugo, and with that shared glance, he turned to leave for bed too. Aizawa turned and Bakugo followed in his step. "You put that tag in him, right?" asked Aizawa as they stepped outside, the sun starting to show the first signs of rising. Bakugo nodded. "Good. Bring it up." Izuku had run without stopping across the UA campus and out into the town below, and he hadn't stopped running until he was well and truly lost. He could follow his own scent back, but he didn't want to go back. He didn't want to see the faces around him. The streets were quiet at this hour, with the sky only just starting to brighten. Izuku hung his head as he slowed to a walk. His vision still lacked color, and he knew he wasn't far off becoming a dog for real. He thought of that white dog again. Surely it wouldn't have any trace of a human mind left by now. Would it be scared, wherever it is, not knowing how it got there, or did dogs not think like that? He guessed he would find out soon enough. He missed being able to cry, to get his emotions out, but with this body all he could do was whimper, and that just wasn't the same. He brushed against a fence, and his collar snagged on a broken wire. Panic rose in him as he squirmed to free himself, pulling back until his collar slipped off over his head and fell to the sidewalk. Izuku looked at it, remembering Bakugo picking it out for him, and this time a whimper did escape his throat. Considering his actions, he assumed that when his human mind faded away, he would forget all about Bakugo, his friends and teachers and his mum. Izuku's eyes flicked to the little GPS tag on his collar. He thought about leaving it behind and forgetting about everyone else, but then he heard something off in the distance that he had heard before. A familiar engine and the muffled barking of dogs. He reached down and pulled at his collar with his teeth until the tags gave way and he swallowed them whole. Something dogs could do surprisingly easy, although he could still feel the objects drag through his throat until it was finally down. He glanced up as the familiar van rounded the corner, the men inside noticing him, maybe even remembering him as they pulled over to grab him, and he let them noose the wires around his neck and take him away, his instincts calling for him to pull away and fight back as they neared the back of the van and loaded him into a crate. The other dogs inside barked and carried on, filling the place with fierce scent that even made Izuku's heart race. Aizawa had gotten them a car and was driving along the streets while Bakugo navigated using the phone app, using it to follow Izuku's path along the streets rather than trying to head straight for him, which was hard to figure from a driving perspective, and knowing Izuku as he did, he figured the boy would stay close to the streets and not go cutting through behind business and backyards. They were heading straight for a while, and Bakugo dared to lift his head with a sigh when he spotted something and told Aizawa to stop. The teacher grumbled but did what was asked of him, stopping in the middle of the street since traffic hadn't picked up yet, and Bakugo burst through the door to pick something up off the street, coming back to the car with the black studded collar in his hands. Aizawa didn't comment on how crestfallen his student looked at the sight of it, and instead went back to driving, continuing straight until Bakugo told him otherwise. "The trail didn't end there?" asked Aizawa as they drove on. "He must have taken it with him." Bakugo hummed in agreement as he scowled down at the phone. If Izuku was running away just to have some alone time, or even if he thought it was for good, why take the GSP tag with him, unless... Bakugo flicked through the app, noticing that after reaching that particular spot, Izuku had either started running again or had gotten into a car. "The dog catchers," spoke up Bakugo, and Aizawa frowned. "That brat," sighed Aizawa. Izuku hadn't planned things to go this way, but these same dog catchers were the only link they had to the white dog that had bitten him. He already knew that Bakugo, knowing him, would be following not far behind. The drive turned rough, bouncing along the gravel road. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he felt close to an hour and guessed that they were outside of city now. Finally the van came to a stop, the dogs inside starting up their scared barking again and the other crates around him, and he got back to his feet, wanting to take in as much information as he could once the van doors opened. When they did, the back of the van was flooded with light, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. There were more people waiting outside, and they each worked in pairs to lift and carry in the crates with thick gloved hands in case any of them decided to bite. It was hard work keeping balance as they unloaded the crates, but Izuku stayed on his feet, peering past them to take in his surroundings. It looked like they had driven out to a rural area. He could see the long gravel driveway they had come up, disappearing behind the trees that lined it, and further back was a house and several large barns close together. From them he could hear more dogs, but the air around the place was tinged with something else other than the smell of fresh trees and dirt and dogs. There was a more clinical smell wafting weakly along the breeze. The crates were carried inside to the closest barn, and the doors shut behind them. They noosed all of the dogs and released them from the crates to be pulled into a stable that had been fixed with metal bars at the top. Along with Izuku there were 3 more dogs, one the same size as him with golden fur and brown patches, but it had a smoother coat, and 2 slightly smaller ones in different shades of brown, one with more wire-like hair. Their captors threw strong-smelling treats into the bars, and only Izuku and the lighter brown wire-haired dog didn't even give them a sniff, and that was enough reason for their captors to step in. A man stepped into the space wearing a full-body padded suit, and noosed both Izuku and the other dog and handed the poles to others waiting outside. Izuku didn't fight it, but the other dog tried to pull back and yelped with fear. Izuku whined back at it, wanting it to calm down, and it seemed to work a little, and the smaller dog stopped fighting, but still kept its head low and tail tucked between its legs as it followed. They led both dogs to the back of the barn and stood waiting as a woman approached them and looked them over. Then she spoke, Izuku only picking up some of the muffled words. "Human speak," Izuku yipped, and the small dog was hesitant but then followed Izuku's lead, and he wagged his tail at the smaller dog. It was starting to make sense now. No wonder Aizawa hadn't been able to find the white dog, it hadn't gone to any rescue or pound, but here instead. The woman nodded to them. "Help," the woman said down to them both with a reassuring smile, and even the small dog's tail wagged a little. "Others keep a while, if take to shelter." She spoke to the others and they nodded to her as she turned and exited the rear of the barn, the 2 men holding their restraints following her, and the dogs walked along. Izuku had both good and bad thoughts about the place as they made their way to the next barn. The woman said help, so perhaps they were tracking down those affected and trying to help undo the Quirk's effect, or it could be the complete opposite, and this was not a good place to be. Either way, he had swallowed the GPS tag, so even if it turned out to be a bad place to be and they weren't here to help them become human again, Bakugo would find him. The second barn had been stripped of being a stable and sectioned off. The first space they entered resembled a vet's with weight scales, a raised stainless steel bench, cupboards along one wall, and a couple of computers. The space was relatively small compared to the size of the barn. In the other sectioned off area, he could hear louder barking. "Hope, mind, keep on, in case," spoke the woman with a smile as they came inside. Izuku assumed she was referring to the dog catcher poles attached to them. They were uncomfortable, but he understood her reasoning. If any of the dogs blacked out while here, they may attack. They stood just inside the doorway as she pulled items from the cupboards and came back, lining large buttons in front of them with large numbers painted on them ranging from 1 to 6. "How long, dog?" she asked, indicating down to the buttons. Izuku's eyes looked down to glance over the numbers. The smaller dog stepped forward, the handler stepping forward with it, as it pressed a paw against the one button, and it made a little ding noise. The woman leaned forward to pet the dog's head and its tail wagged, looking more relaxed. Izuku stepped forward, thinking about it. She couldn't mean days because Izuku had been a dog almost 3 weeks now, so he pressed his paw to the 3 button and received a pet too. She made some notes on her computer and cleared away the buttons, and they were led to the large scales to be weighed. Next she brought out large dots and laid them on the ground before them, bringing one up at a time to perform another test. Izuku was led up first, and he glanced over the dots, an array of grays, yellows, and blues. "Blue," spoke the woman, and she repeated the words slowly several times for Izuku to catch on. But he was confused. There were 2 different blues in front of him beside each other, so he placed a front paw on each. The woman scribbled something on a clipboard and Izuku stepped back. "Purple," she said, but Izuku didn't see any purple. She asked a couple more times slowly and calmly, but when Izuku only looked to her, she moved on. "Green," but he saw no green. "Yellow," again there were 2 yellows and he selected both. "Red," but there was no red. Izuku started to feel disheartened. He understood the test, and he knew that each of the colors she asked for were there, but his dog eyes couldn't see them. He had known his color vision had been fading, but now it was really hitting him, especially when the smaller dog took its turn and chose a dot for each color she called. After that they were done. "Good candidates," spoke the woman with a smile, but Izuku didn't feel it in him to wag his tail. She opened the doors to the next area and Izuku's ears were assaulted by the onslaught of barks and rattling bars. Both walls were lined with sectioned-off areas with walled sides and metal bars at the front, each containing a single dog inside. There was at least 15 other dogs in the space and Izuku felt shocked, knowing that each of them were the same as him, a human-turned-dog. All the dogs were large, the smallest only being slightly smaller than the wiry brown dog beside him. A thought crossed his mind wondering if they were smaller because they were younger, and he felt so sorry for them. Would their parents have recognized them when they came home as scared dogs or had they been shut out to stay on the streets, scared and alone? Izuku realized how lucky he had been to have Bakugo. Over half of the dogs in the room weren't in their right minds and were barking aggressively at the newcomers as they passed. Only a few watched on with curious, conscious eyes. Izuku saw the white dog that had bitten him among them, staring at him intently. He seemed to have his human mind for now, but if Izuku's experience was anything to go by, he assumed the white dog spent more time in the mind of a dog than a human these days. The woman led them to the rear where there were empty enclosures and the woman turned to speak to them. "Wait. Turn soon." She pulled a key card from her belt and scanned it before the barred door. It beeped when it unlocked and Izuku was ushered inside before it was locked behind him. The same was repeated for the second dog, opposite him, and now they waited. For what? Izuku wasn't entirely sure. He wanted to believe that the people here really intended to help, but being locked inside a box didn't make it feel that way. The place was filled with the fear scent from the other dogs who had come to and not realized where they were, and the fear scent of others would just set them off into a panic. The barking never stopped as multiple dogs switched back and forth between their human mind and that of a dog's. Izuku wished he could shut out the constant noise, but it was impossible, and despite his better judgment, the atmosphere of the room made him pace and his heart race. He started to wish he had never left, that he had stayed at Bakugo's side regardless of what he guessed had happened. Maybe he would have been happy staying at the dorms even as a full dog with all of the attention and love from his classmates, as they came back each day and welcomed him. If he were a real dog, they could keep him out of stressful situations, and he would be the best dog ever, or he hoped. Or maybe he would be sent back to live with his mom. Would he live a shorter life as a dog? Wouldn't that make everyone around him sad? He shook himself. He didn't want to think about it. 20 minutes in, the room had been vacant of people since Izuku, and the other dog had been placed here when a couple of men armed with dog catcher poles came in from through the back of the barn, closest to them. They peered through papers on a clipboard, moving from enclosure to enclosure, looking at the dogs inside, shaking their head as they came to barking dog after barking dog, until they came to the next one on their list that was quiet and focused and clearly in the mind of a human, and they took that one with them, looping the wire around its neck. But it came along peacefully as they walked back to the rear of the barn, passing Izuku and out. Izuku assumed it was being moved to the next barn along, and the clinical smell came through stronger on the breeze before the door was closed. Fear spiked inside Izuku at what could be happening in the next barn, and it only worsened when minutes later he could hear whimpering and yelping and screaming coming through the walls, which only riled the other dogs up more. "Where the hell are you going? I said it was that way," scowled Bakugo from the passenger seat as Izuku drove past their turning point. "It was a private driveway," he replied flatly. "I'll park further along and then we go on foot." Bakugo turned back to face the front in his seat with a humph. He didn't care if it was private property or not. He wanted Izuku back. They had followed the GPS trail out of the city, getting caught up in the morning traffic, and then out into rural forested area. They had been following along the same strip of road for a while now, and it was forested on both sides, only ever broken by the occasional long driveway that turned around the trees so you couldn't see anything beyond. It seemed more like "I have enough money to live on large land property that for farming," but he wouldn't be surprised if most still had some farm animals. Some even had signs up advertising equestrian businesses. Izuku pulled over amongst the trees and stepped out. Bakugo followed with a stretch. Without a word his teacher turned and led the way back to the long gravel driveway they had passed and ducked into the tree line, Bakugo following with a silent scowl. He knew his teacher wanted them to be stealthy and assess the situation first, but all Bakugo felt like doing was getting there as fast as possible. The anxiety inside his chest still flared up when he felt they were moving too slow and racing the clock for Izuku. On the plus side for Aizawa, Bakugo's anxiety made him quiet. They finally reached the end of the tree line following the curving driveway to find a large, cleared plot of land complete with several barns close together, and a large house on the other side. Several cars were parked in front of the house, and the same dog catcher van they had seen before beside the first barn. Inside they could hear barking. They both lowered themselves further as a pair of men came through the first barn door, carrying a crate with a Izuku-sized gold and brown dog, loaded it into the van and went back to retrieve a second slightly smaller brown dog. They closed them into the van and got in themselves and turned to head back down the driveway. "What now?" hissed Bakugo without looking away from the barns. "We investigate," replied Aizawa. "You check out the barns closest to us. I'll check out the back ones in the house. For now, stay hidden and don't do anything stupid." He glared to his student. "If you see Midoriya, get him out if you can. He's our priority. We can figure out the rest once he's out of harm's way." Bakugo nodded and then they split. Aizawa keeping to the trees as he moved closer to the house, and Bakugo did the same in the opposite direction, ducking across the driveway, to get closer to the first barn. Most of the barking seemed to be coming from the barn further back, but he didn't want to leave the first one unchecked. He checked the clearing before he broke from the trees to reach the first barn. He couldn't hear anything inside, but if he walked right in he may have found himself wrong. He skirted the side of the barn until he came across a down pipe and climbed his way up it, until he was level with an open window frame that told him that the barns must have an upper story for storage, and he reached for it, sliding his body along the timber till he reached the frame and pulled himself up. Bakugo let himself down lightly onto the upper level, cringing as the timber creaked under his weight. Bundles of hay were still stored up here, and as he peered down below it looked like the barn used to house horses as it was lined with stables. One stable, closest to the front, had been fixed with metal bars, but beyond that, nothing looked out of the ordinary, and he couldn't see or hear anyone down below, so he moved on to the next barn in the same fashion. The second barn looked very different. The front third sectioned off to look like a makeshift vet clinic, while the back section was lined with large cages for dogs. Most of the dogs were close to Izuku's size or larger, with only a couple of smaller ones, and most were barking their effing heads off. Bakugo scanned over them from the level above until he spotted his large green dog pacing in its cage towards the rear of the barn. He shifted his weight, making a move to get closer when the floor creaked and some of the dogs looked up, their barking intensified. With a constant chorus of barking, no one outside noticed a change, so Bakugo moved on, making it across to the other side of the barn before dropping down to the ground level. Izuku's head snapped his way, and as he approached the bars, Izuku came forward, his tail wagging, pleased to see him. "Hang on, Deku, I'll get you out." Bakugo could see that the metal door needed some kind of key to skin, so he pressed his hand to the lock and blasted it. Izuku had stepped back, and when Bakugo lifted the door off its hinges, Izuku rushed forward to meet him, almost toppling the blonde over. Izuku had to resist the urge to lick his face. He was sure Bakugo wouldn't be a fan. "Let's go," called Bakugo as he got up and went to the rear door, but when he looked back, Izuku hadn't moved, still standing in the middle staring to him. If there was some thought behind his green eyes, Bakugo didn't know it. "Come on, nerd, move it," he hissed. Izuku flicked his ears and shuffled his paws but didn't move. Bakugo was about to go back and drag him out by his scruff when a noise behind him clicked, and he turned to face a man who had stepped in through the back door. The man's head was turned back as he spoke to someone while he stepped inside, but froze when he turned to see Bakugo and Izuku standing in the center of the room. The man balked, his hands reaching out to support him before he fell back through the door. His partner behind him called out, wanting to know what was wrong, but as the man caught himself on the door, his fingers pressed down on a button and his eyes turned wide before he jumped out and shut the door behind him, followed by a locking sound. On the wall beside the door was a keypad with several buttons on it. His finger had only grazed one, but that was all it took for chaos to break out. The room filled with the beeps that indicated that several doors had been unlocked, and 4 of them swung open together. Bakugo swore. The idiot man had unlocked a section of pens and 3 dogs stepped out. 2 large ones and a slightly smaller one. If there was an occupant in the 4th, it didn't come out. The smaller one tried to make a break for the far side of the room, but as it crossed the path of one of the bigger ones, it snapped at it, grabbing in its jaws and pinned it down while it yelped. Izuku spun on his heel and charged the larger dog, lowering his head to knock it off of the smaller one, which retreated with yelps back to its pen. The larger dog snapped at Izuku, and he leapt out of the way in time. The second large dog stepped in to snap and snarl at Izuku too. Izuku opened his mouth and bared his teeth back at the 2 slightly larger dogs, and they did the same in return. Bakugo held his breath. He wanted to take action and help, but if he got bitten at all, he would be stuck like Izuku, and if the larger dogs had a more serious go at him while he was thrashing on the ground changing like Izuku had, there would be nothing he could do about it, even if he would beat their asses even as a dog. The standoff continued, Izuku slowly being pushed back as the other 2 formed up beside each other and took turns snapping their jaws towards him. Bakugo's anxiety and thoughts had held him back when hell broke loose and the 2 dogs leapt for Izuku. One snapped, the second bowled him over, the first placed its paws on him, the second bit at his leg and Izuku yelped out in pain, thrashing to try to pull his leg free. The first sunk its teeth into the back of his neck and shook him with a growl. Izuku cried out and continued to thrash against them, twisting his head back to snap at the first dog. "Bastards!" cried Bakugo as he ran for them, palms popping. The second dog lifted its head to look at the new threat and bared its teeth at the boy. Bakugo shot an explosion forwards, enough for the dog to retreat several steps and turned his hand to the first. Izuku took the moment to snap his teeth onto the foreleg of the dog holding him, and it released him with a screech. He pushed off of the dog and got back to his feet with a quick shake, flicking blood across the ground and lifted his head to snarl again. Izuku sprung in Bakugo's direction, knocking away the second dog lunging for him. He dug his teeth into the dog's shoulder, and it swung its head around to grab at his, but Izuku refused to let go despite the pain. The first dog went for Izuku's hind legs again when Bakugo fended it off with another close explosion, close enough to singe the fur on Izuku's tail. Bakugo and Izuku backed up closer to the rear door, each fending the dogs away from each other. Despite their efforts, the pair of dogs wouldn't back down and Izuku had the worst of it, his fur matted with blood. Bakugo was pissed. He wanted to do more, but Izuku would keep putting himself in harm's way to prevent him from getting bitten. Izuku stood ahead of him, being the wall between him and the 2 dogs, so he took the moment to blast at the door, but as the timber blasted away he saw a steel door beneath it. He swore out loud, his next option being up. Bakugo let off a larger blast over his head, startling the 2 dogs, and they backed away with confusion. He came forward and bent to wrap an arm around Izuku, ready to use his free hand to at least blast them to the second level, but Izuku snapped at him in warning, and he already knew why. If they removed themselves from the dog's reach, they would turn on the other 2 hiding away in their pens. As Bakugo stepped back to avoid Izuku's snap, the other 2 charged forward, both aiming for Izuku with jaws wide open and their bloody teeth showing. Izuku lunged to meet them, and the growling and snapping was terrifying. Izuku was terrifying. But the green dog held its own better now than it did before, desperate to defend the boy behind it. Bakugo stood at the ready to fire a blast their way, but with Izuku's back to him he was too close to fire anything, and his previous blast to startle them had only brought them back fueled with more anger and fear. The dogs fought raised up on their hind legs as they scrabbled and snapped at each other. Izuku battered one down, but the other grabbed him at the throat and threw him down. Izuku snarled under the larger dog, flailing and kicking at its body. Bakugo came forward again, this time coming right in close enough to feel the attacking dog's fur tickle his palm before he released his blast, and the dog flew back with a yelp. Through the haze of smoke the second dog burst through, its jaws snapping shut on Bakugo's left forearm, and the boy snarled from the pain. Izuku was on his feet in a second and brought his teeth down on the dog's shoulder, and bit down hard enough to break through flesh and bone, and the dog released the boy's arm with a shriek. Bakugo reared back, clutching at his arm. His heart raced. He had seen what comes next. Izuku was panting heavily, blood dripping from his mouth as he glanced up at Bakugo, and he thought he saw sadness or concern shining there. The bite throbbed so severely that Bakugo saw spots dance across his vision, and he staggered. He fell to his knees as a burning sensation radiated through his body from the bite, and Izuku pressed close to him, keeping his back to him so he could watch for if the dogs came at them again. Bakugo couldn't help the chocked sound of pain that escaped his throat, and his eyes watered, clutching at the green dog beside him to stop himself from hitting the ground. His heart was racing so much that the sound of it drumming in his chest was in his ears, and it felt hard to breathe as each wave of pain took his breath away. He couldn't believe that Izuku had made it through this already. One dog stayed away, limping to the far end, while the last remaining one came back their way, snarling. Izuku pressed close to Bakugo as a growl reverberated through his body, warning the other to stay away. The door behind them swung open and two men dressed in full padded suits charged in with dog catcher poles to grab the dog. It took its fear and aggression out on the men, but they managed to noose it and pin it down. A woman followed in, and she hurried to Bakugo's side, ignoring Izuku's warning growl, and uncapped a syringe between her teeth and stabbed it into Bakugo's thigh. Usually it would have hurt, but at this point Izuku's body was the only thing keeping Bakugo off the ground. The pain started to subside and Bakugo felt he could take in full breaths of air again. Izuku was still pressed against him, panting, Bakugo's arm draped across his back to keep him from falling. Aizawa came in behind the woman and crouched down beside his two troublesome students. He didn't bother to ask if they were okay, he could see they weren't, so he turned back to face the woman. "I gave him the antidote. He won't change," spoke the woman, although her voice shook from the close call. The men had moved the other dogs back to their pens. "Sedate the injured ones," called the woman. "Once they are out, tend to their injuries." She turned to Izuku, who didn't growl at her this time. "You did so well defending him," she praised with a soothing voice and laid a hand gently on Izuku. "Come this way." She spoke to Aizawa, and he helped Bakugo stand again and ushered the student out, who seemed a bit shaky on his feet. He looked back to Izuku, wondering if he needed to carry the boy, but Izuku stepped after them, doing his best to keep his back left leg off the ground. The woman led them into the next barn, which looked even more clinical still and smelt of cleaning agents. The barn had been concreted inside with a cleared space in the middle. On the side wall stood tables of bubbling chemicals that several people labored over. In the corner closest to them were several metal chairs, and she pulled them out for Bakugo to lower himself onto, and Izuku sat close to him, still panting lightly. "I suppose you would like an explanation," offered the woman as she stood opposite the three of them, Aizawa moving forward to stand behind his students. "No shit," spat Bakugo, though he didn't lift his head to glare. If he wasn't in such a state, Aizawa would have smacked him across the back of his blonde head. "My brother started this months ago," she began with a sigh. "It was his quirk that did this." As she went on, it clicked to Aizawa that her brother was the quirk user the police had found but had disappeared from his home. The woman, his sister, explained that his quirk allowed him to turn into a dog, but after a bad drug trip that boosted quirks, his quirk changed, and his bites could turn others into dogs, and she had been trying to clean up his mess since. Her own brother had refused to change back from being a dog until he lost his mind to it, and was now a normal, everyday dog who lived with their parents. She went on to explain that she also had a quirk that allowed her to turn into a dog, and by using her DNA they had started to create their own antidote to turn those affected back into human. "Progress is slow though, we don't have the funds to speed up production," she sighed sadly. "We've had to prioritize those who have been stuck that way the longest. But we can't administer the doses until they are conscious of their human selves, so the longer it's left the harder it is to treat them because they become more and more like a real dog and spend less time with a human mind." She took a deep breath. "As it is, we can only manage production of about 2 to 3 doses a day." "Why not go to the police about it?" asked Aizawa flatly. "If I did that, my family could go under fire. My parents are both retired, and I don't want their last years being so distressing," she apologized. Izuku gave a long sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Give your next dose to my student and I'll fund your production," he said with a stern look. It wasn't really an offer despite how he chose to phrase it. "How long until the next dose is ready?" Very soon. Maybe 30 minutes, she replied. "Good, give it to him." Izuku pointed to Izuku, who had moved to lay down during the exchange. Bakugo had been leaning forward, lazily petting him as he listened. "If you can only make so much in a day, then how'd you get one for me so damn fast?" spoke up Bakugo, sitting up straighter. "We always keep one extra in case someone gets bitten. But we only had the one. If anyone here was to get bitten after, we would just confine them until more was made." Bakugo didn't have a response, and just continued to glare. "Your student is injured though, we should dash," she began, looking to Izuku. The blood had begun to dry and made his fur stiff with dark spikes. "Won't it be easier without all the fur?" replied Izuku, and the woman couldn't disagree. They sat around for the remaining time it took to complete the batch the people on the other side were working on, and in the meantime, the woman tended to Bakugo's bite, cleaning it and wrapping it in bandages. With the spare time, she washed Izuku's fur with a damp cloth, whispering to him how brave and strong he had been. The tip of Izuku's tail wagged at the words of praise he picked up, but he didn't have the energy to lift his head. Finally, the people called that the dose was ready, and everyone got to their feet with anticipation. Izuku didn't know what was going on, but he got to his feet because Bakugo did. Words were said that Izuku didn't pick up on, and Bakugo touched his head lightly, directing his attention to him, and then led Izuku to the middle of the room where they stepped onto a large stainless steel surface. Bakugo petted his head, ruffling his fur and ears. "Stay," he heard, and then Bakugo stepped away. Izuku sat down heavily with a long exhausted huff as he waited for what to do next. Bakugo walked back to Izuku's side as they stood at the edge of the room. "I must add," the woman spoke up, a syringe prepped in her hand. "We have found that the longer they have been dogs, sometimes some of those traits carry across." "You're telling us this now?" barked Bakugo, and Izuku turned his head to look back at him from where he sat. "It's the best we can offer," she replied calmly. "Also, it will be painful for him, so please restrain yourselves until it's over." Izuku nodded to her, and Bakugo gritted his teeth. Izuku shot him a glare until he nodded too. The woman nodded back and went to Izuku. Izuku turned his head the other way as the woman came up to him on his right side. She knelt beside him with her warm, reassuring smile and spoke. "Sorry, hurt, fix." Izuku only blinked at her, and he felt a pinch in his foreleg and pulled it away from her, but she only continued to smile and stood, walking away calmly. Izuku huffed in her direction and moved to face Bakugo's way again when a pain shot up his foreleg. He got to his feet, fur bristling and panting from the pain. It hurt like fire, and he wanted Bakugo, he wanted comfort. He took a step, then collapsed, squealing. His limbs twitched as his whole body shot through with pain like bolts of electricity. The sight was hard for Bakugo to watch, and he instinctually went a step forward to be closer to the nerd, but Izuku's hand grabbed his shoulder and a firm gaze held him in place, and he clenched his jaw hard enough for it to hurt as Izuku writhed in pain before them. His fur shrank back, revealing skin underneath. His front toes stretched to fingers again, and his face shortened until only a naked, sweating human form was left panting on the metal surface. Izuku let go and Bakugo rushed forward, skidding to a halt beside Izuku. He was naked, but rolled onto his side, keeping himself decent whether he meant it or not. "Deku?" asked Bakugo with wide eyes, and Izuku's eyes fluttered open and lifted to look up to the blonde's face. Izuku was still catching his breath, but he smiled weakly to his friend. His ear twitched. "I can hear you." Izuku smiled, his voice raspy and breathless. Bakugo's eyes lifted to the top of Izuku's head. He had seen movement there, and his mouth hung open as he took in the sight. His gaze racked down Izuku's body, checking him over, seeing the multiple wounds on him, and then stopped again. He closed his eyes tightly, took a deep breath, then returned his gaze to Izuku, who shivered against the metal surface. He gave the green-haired boy a soft smile, and Izuku's own smile grew wider, and that made Bakugo's breath catch again. The woman came over to offer a blanket to the naked boy, and he slowly sat up, wrapping himself in it, and Bakugo took his hand, pulling him to his feet. Izuku winced and held on to Bakugo still. He didn't trust himself on two legs again. The woman offered for him to take a seat as she pulled various items out of the first aid kit she had used on Bakugo, and lined them up by the seat. The first few steps were wobbly, but Izuku improved quickly and managed to lower himself in the seat by himself. Aizawa and Bakugo waited patiently to the side while Izuku's wounds were treated, and the woman gave him a once-over before giving him the all-clear. Aizawa gave her his contact details, promising to call once he got his students back home, and one of the workers drove them all down the long driveway and back to the car Aizawa was using, still parked by the trees. Izuku seemed so out of it, wearing nothing but a blanket that the moment he was seated in the back and Aizawa started driving, he was out like a light. Aizawa dared to smirk and Bakugo glared at him. "What's so funny?" he asked his teacher. "I don't think he's noticed yet," replied the teacher with another quick glance in the rear-view mirror. "We'll deal with it later," sighed Bakugo as he pressed his elbow on the car door and rested his face against his fist as he watched the scenery pass by. "You really going to help them?" he asked without looking away from the window. "Of course," sighed Aizawa. Despite everything, she had good intentions. "I'll speak to the principal about it." And the three of them remained silent until they arrived back at ᴜᴘ-ᴛᴏ's front gate. Aizawa had called ahead to arrange a pair of assistance robots with a stretcher to be waiting at the gates, and after they had woken Izuku, he sat on it to be carted away, Bakugo walking alongside as they headed for Recovery Girl's office. Aizawa went along to see the principal. Classes were still on for the day, so the campus felt empty, and the hallways bare while all the students were tucked in their classrooms, and Bakugo was grateful for that. He needed to sort a few things out with Izuku before the rest of the class saw him. Recovery Girl had been made aware of their arrival, but still shook her head at the boys as they entered, poor Izuku still in nothing but a blanket. He sat on the edge of one of the beds while Bakugo stood close by. He had offered to leave and retrieve some of Izuku's clothes for him, but the nurse had scolded him to wait until she worked on him. After some backwards and forwards between them both, Bakugo getting more heated with each exchange, she finally agreed to give his arm her healing kiss so he could leave to get Izuku clothes while she worked on him. What Bakugo hadn't expected is to break out at a run so he could get back there faster, snatching clothes blindly from Izuku's room and racing back. When he returned, Izuku tilted his head at him while he was panting in the doorway. He saw that the blanket had been moved to cover Izuku's hips and below so the nurse could remove the bandages and assess the wounds. She was unwrapping the last bandage around Izuku's neck, and Bakugo stepped forward to drop the clothes beside him, feeling a prick of guilt at his injuries. While Bakugo had gotten through it with only the one bite, Izuku hadn't been so lucky. His throat was bruised, the back of his neck had puncture marks, his shoulder had gotten away with only light punctures, but as Recovery Girl worked her way down and got Izuku to arrange himself in such a way that his left leg could be out of the blanket while still remaining modest, Bakugo could see even deeper puncture marks there, and the wounds still looked red and angry. Recovery Girl cleaned the wounds again, kissed each of them, and then rewrapped them in clean gauze and bandages before she offered them both some candy and left the room with a smirk. Bakugo glared after her for her amused look, but she didn't see it. "So, have you noticed yet?" asked Bakugo, turning back around. "Noticed what?" asked Izuku, his ears pricking. Bakugo rolled his eyes and went to retrieve a mirror from the nurse's desk. He had been in here enough to know where it was kept and brought it back for Izuku to hold. Izuku looked to him dubiously, but took it from him and peered into it, his jaw dropping. "Oh, wow," he said, but his voice was more shock than joy. He reached a hand up to touch one of the pointed green ears sticking out from his hair atop his head. "Wow," he breathed again. He turned his head to check under his hair where his ears would usually be, but there was nothing there, which looked odd to him. If he let his hair grow out a little longer, it would cover the sides completely for him. He had noticed something else in his reflection, and he opened his mouth wide to see his upper and lower canines were both more pronounced than they used to be. And down below, added Bakugo, turning his gaze away. Below? Izuku squeaked and got to his feet. He opened up the blanket to check himself, found that his front looked the same, and then dared to turn his head to look back. Short green hair ran down the middle of his lower back, until it reached a shaggy green tail matching his hair color. I have a tail! His voice cracked. Yep, replied Bakugo without looking back. Well, this is amazing. His voice called out, and Bakugo dared to look back to see how the nerd found it so. Luckily, Izuku had wrapped the blanket around his waist already and held it there with one hand. Seeing Bakugo facing his way again, he limped his way beaming, his canines showing, and Bakugo suspected he was coming in for an excited hug. Whoa, fuck, put some clothes on first, warned Bakugo, raising his hands to keep the greenette away. When he backed away, Bakugo turned his back to him and Izuku changed, pulling on his surprising assortment of clothes, being some fresh underwear Bakugo had actually snatched from the top drawer, cargo shorts from the end of his bed, the shirt he slept in from the floor, as well as a single sock that got mixed in there somewhere. Izuku stared down at the single sock with a smirk. Thanks, Kaken, he spoke, and Bakugo took it to mean it was safe for him to turn back around. Izuku slipped on the single sock and beamed to the blonde. Thanks for everything. And Bakugo turned away again, his ears burning. They left the nurse's office to head back to their dorm. Aizawa hadn't said anything about going back to class, so why would they? Izuku had to keep adjusting his pants while they walked, having to have them sit lower than usual for his tail to sit out. He contemplated shoving it down the back of one of his shorts' legs, but if he was going to be stuck with a tail, hiding it would be annoying, and there was a wide range of clothes out there for those with tails. He would have to go shopping for new bottoms the next chance he got. Once back at the dorm, Bakugo found that his room had been tidied from how trashed Izuku had made it that morning, and he knew exactly who had done it, Kirishima. He would thank him later. He grabbed a belt from his room and found Izuku milling around outside and offered it to him, explaining to loop it through as usual but keep it a little loose to stick his tail through between the belt and the top of the shorts. It wasn't great, but it would do for now, and Izuku beamed at him again, his tail wagging. It had been a long time since it had just been Bakugo and the nerd together alone in the dorms, and it was too quiet without everyone else around. Izuku went to shower, and he took his sweet-ass time about it, and when he emerged, hair still damp, he found that Bakugo had made lunch for them both. Bakugo joked about whether to give it to him in his dog bowl or not, and Izuku's ears had dropped, and a whimper escaped him, and Bakugo had to cover his face to stop from laughing and blushing. He watched as Izuku ate the food, and he knew he liked it from how his green tail wagged. They spoke for a bit after lunch, touching base that Izuku recalled all his memories from his time as a dog, except for when his mind had faded to that of a real dog, and Bakugo brought up several embarrassing occasions to rub in the nerd's face, and he blushed furiously. To Bakugo's surprise, Izuku bit back a few times, pointing out how nice the blonde had been to him as a dog, and Bakugo fought to defend himself with the fact that Aizawa had made him responsible for him. Finally, the school day was over, and any moment now their classmates would be rushing back. Izuku stood in the entryway, his tail wagging with excitement, while Bakugo stood beside him with a scowl and his hands shoved in his pockets. "Hey, Kaken!" piped up Izuku. "What?" grumbled Bakugo and glanced to him. Izuku raised his left arm, scars visible on his forearm from the first dog bite. "We match," he beamed, and Bakugo had to look away again, the nerd's face too bright to look at directly. Izuku leaned in closer, their shoulders touching as he smiled before the door opened and they were welcomed with gasps. The class had a small party that night. Sato baked a cake and other sweets while some of the girls raced out to get some snacks and drinks, and everyone commented on Izuku's fluffy pointed ears and tail and teeth. When anyone asked to touch them, he obliged and even seemed to enjoy the touch on his head. Everyone joked and laughed about embarrassing things he did as a dog, and others reflected on how good of a hero in training he had been even as a dog. Izuku's tail wagged when he recalled Bakugo choosing him to be on his team and saying he wasn't useless. After the evening started to quiet down and Bakugo made a move to leave, Izuku followed after him and called to Kirishima to join them in private. "I'm so sorry if I did anything to hurt or frighten you," he began awkwardly. "I mean, I don't remember it, but I knew I did something to scare the others at least." He looked down at his feet. "Nah, man," smiled Kirishima and patted Izuku's shoulder. "You were fierce as hell." He beamed, and both their eyes turned to Bakugo, who glared. "It was intimidating," he admitted quietly. "But it was cool." He turned away to continue to the elevator. Kirishima gave him another pat on the shoulder and headed back to the party. But Izuku didn't feel like things were resolved yet and followed after Bakugo, stepping into the elevator with him. "What do you want, nerd?" grumbled Bakugo as he pressed both his floor and Izuku's and the elevator started to rise. You did a lot for me." He tried to find the words. "So," replied Bakugo. "I wanted to thank you," offered Izuku awkwardly. "You've already said it 100 times." "It's fine." Bakugo rolled his eyes and the elevator stopped, opening its door to the second level, and when Izuku didn't move to get out, Bakugo fixed his gaze on him. What pushed Bakugo as the doors closed again? I wanted to dash." "Spit it out," snapped the blonde. "I wanted to sleep with you tonight," blurted out the brunette, and his face flushed. "The hell, why?" glared Bakugo, but it wasn't all there. He leaned back a little. It would feel weird without you," he answered shyly. Bakugo's face changed to a smirk. "You want to sleep on the floor? Don't complain to me when I step on you in the morning." "You never stepped on me as a dog," snapped back Izuku, his embarrassment gone. "That's 'cause dogs are cute," shrugged back Bakugo as the doors opened to his floor and Izuku followed him out. "I'm plenty cute," he argued, and Bakugo had to stifle a laugh. "There's a difference between dog cute and human cute," he retorted as he reached for his door. "So I am cute?" argued back Izuku, and when Bakugo spun around to face him, his smile was wonky. "That's not what I said," smirked back the blonde. "You did not say it," pushed Izuku, and he dared to do a smirk of his own, and Bakugo could only look down at him. "Fine," he said, and opened the door before stepping back for Izuku to enter. Suddenly it felt like a bad idea, but when he hesitated, Bakugo pushed him in and stepped in behind him, closing the door. "It's what you wanted," smirked Bakugo as he stepped past, noticing Izuku's uncomfortable expression. His confidence had been short-lived. Bakugo moved to his desk, picking something up and throwing it Izuku's way. "Put this on." He grinned and Izuku caught it and looked down at the black studded collar in his hand. His collar. "It'll be too big," argued Izuku. "I'll punch some more holes in it." He shrugged. "Give it here." He held out a hand for it, and Izuku stepped forward to hand it back. He hadn't expected Bakugo to pull a heavy-duty hole punch from his desk that he used for his own costume and belts. "That reminds me," spoke up Bakugo without looking up from his hole punching that he paid extra attention to space out evenly. "What happened to those tags you swallowed?" he asked. "I could follow you around forever if it stays there." He smirked as he worked. "I told Recovery Girl about it," Izuku replied as he sat down on the edge of Bakugo's bed behind him as he worked at the desk. "She wants to take an X-ray tomorrow and said I may have to get surgery to remove them, but that's okay." He glanced around the room while he spoke. Replied Bakugo as he spun around on his desk chair and whipped his hands around Izuku's neck, holding the collar there to size it. Izuku froze under his closeness and didn't breathe again till the blonde pulled away. "Kaken, I thought you were joking," whined Izuku from the bed when Bakugo returned to facing the desk, this time pulling out cutting tools. "Why would I be joking?" he asked without lifting his head. "Why would you want me to wear a collar?" frowned Izuku. "I picked it for you, duh, plus I want to see something," he answered as he cut at the collar. "See what?" pushed Izuku. "Just wait," growled back Bakugo, and Izuku fell silent. Bakugo turned back around on his desk chair and leaned forward again with the collar in hand, but this time Izuku leaned away. Bakugo frowned at him and stood from the chair to come closer. "Kaken," Izuku complained as he crawled back on the bed until his back touched the wall, but Bakugo followed, kneeling on the bed before him. "Just hold still," warned Bakugo, and when Izuku went to slip off the end of the bed, Bakugo pounced and pinned him down, wrestling the collar on. Izuku squirmed and complained, but he didn't activate his quirk to force him off, and that was enough for Bakugo. He did the collar up loosely around Izuku's bandaged neck, then got up. Izuku scrambled into a sitting position and reached for the collar. "Don't," called Bakugo. "Just leave it for a minute." Izuku dropped his hands but glared at the blonde. Bakugo got off of the bed and narrowed his eyes as he took in the sight. He had to admit, with ears and a tail, Izuku looked good in the collar. Bakugo smirked. "What?" spoke up Izuku, still glaring. "Not telling," shot back Bakugo and turned away. "Tell me." Izuku's voice came out like a growl and Bakugo tensed. "You know what, you should go," replied Bakugo. "What? Go? Why?" "Because I said so, nerd," growled Bakugo as he finally turned back. Izuku was on his feet now, the collar still on over his wrapped neck, and he stood before him. "And I asked why?" growled back Izuku, baring his teeth, and Bakugo snapped. He leaned forward through the space between them and locked his lips to Izuku's, who grew tense but didn't step away. "Because it's hot, that's why," answered Bakugo finally, leaning back to his full height. Izuku looked stunned before him, speechless as his face turned red. "ᴘᴇᴜ," his voice cracked. "What, you didn't like it?" asked the blonde with a frown. "I didn't say that, I just wasn't expecting it," stammered the brunette. Seeing him flustered made Bakugo smirk. "If you want to stay, keep the collar on, if not, give it here and you can leave," he offered, holding a hand out, but Izuku only stared up at him. He diverted his gaze after a moment to the floor and stepped back, slowly sitting himself on the edge of the bed again, and he stared into his lap. "Do you like me like that, just because I was a dog?" whispered Izuku. "What?" "No," scoffed Bakugo as he sat back down on the desk chair across from the nerd. "Then what was that about?" he asked, raising his eyes. Bakugo didn't want to have to explain it all. He liked the nerd, always had he guessed, but when he started to think that he'd never get to see the idiot's face again or hear his voice, he had started to get scared, and the more he explored why he was scared, the deeper it got. Now that he had Deku back in front of him, he was fighting the urge to wrap himself around him and not let go. He had been so worried that he would lose him forever, and he didn't want to risk not taking action again. Training to be heroes, anything could happen after they graduate. "I liked you already, nerd," replied Bakugo, trying to play it cool, but inside his heart was racing. "Oh, okay," replied Izuku, looking back down at his lap, but Bakugo saw his tail twitch. "That's all I get?" asked Bakugo with a scowl. No, sorry, I like you too," he replied, flushed, and his tail twitched again. Bakugo smirked, pleased to hear it. "Collar on or off?" he pushed again. "On," replied Izuku, and it was settled, Bakugo moving from the chair to sit close beside Izuku, leaning in to close the distance between them again, and this time Izuku was more relaxed. Life went back to its normal routine after that with very few changes. Izuku got the next day off to have the tags removed from his gut, then returned to class the following day, but wasn't allowed to join in on any exercises until Recovery Girl said so, which was 2 days later with her help. It became apparent to everyone that Izuku had maintained more of his dog traits than just his external features. He had sharper hearing than before and a stronger nose, which made him exceptional for search and rescue exercises, or for picking up an enemy's presence earlier than everyone else. He already had quick reflexes, but now during battle exercises he would stick lower to the ground than he used to, crouching on all fours before jumping, but he made it into his own style, and it worked out well. With the help of ᴜᴚ, the remaining trap dogs were all returned to their human forms, many keeping dog-like features about them, ranging from only a stronger nose to some looking more hound dog-like, and the family did eventually have to face some charges over the case. Izuku's mom could look over her son's psychical changes, just happy that he was alright. And Bakugo sulked around for the first week while Izuku had to catch up on weeks of work and notes that everyone supplied him. He had finally made the nerd his, put a collar on him and everything. in private, yet he wasn't allowed to do anything until he was done catching up, which only frustrated him more. Once that was over, though, he could finally spend more time with his nerd. His Deku.